When the young king of Qin folded 7 banners into one, he did not only extinguish the bright colors of the warring states, he dimmed the discordant voices of scholars and clerks who had once argued in bright courtyards, as if vigorous debate itself were a border needing to be pacified. Pause. The newborn empire, he believed, needed a single breath, and he gave it one by melting coinage into a common mold, shaving axles to the same width so carts would fit the same ruts, pressing roads into straight, hard lines that tied distant valleys to the capital, and stacking laws that permitted no deviation from the letter. Pause. Bricks wore stamped numbers like oaths, steelies cut characters like knives, and labor columns moved like sand under a steady wind, until peace felt less like a meadow and more like a polished floor on which a misstep had consequences. Pause. Edicts were not simply announcements. They were chisels that trimmed the world into rectangles, and when bundles of bamboo and silk were fed to fire, the crackle sounded like reasoning being smothered by policy. Aaron, pause. He called it cleaning up disorder, but the hush of that cleaning was the rasp of an iron broom on stone, long, cold, and regular, until even the cautious learned to keep their syllables short. Pause. In Xianyang, the glaze on the tiles had barely cooled. Stairways seemed to run without end. Guards held their eyes at a prescribed angle. Clerks stacked their slips with a prescribed pressure, and every gaze tilted toward the throne, as if toward a sun that permitted no dusk. For sunset in such a system looked suspiciously like disobedience. Behind the thick walls, another project swelled beyond the scale of its century, a city for the dead to rival the city of the living. The emperor's tomb became an unspoken command, crushing hundreds of thousands of shoulders that had learned only how to bend and move. The decree did not shout, it pressed. Wam, pause. They dug as if excavating time, kneaded earth as if kneading silence, placed bricks as if counting the breaths they had left, while above them overseers stood stiff as posts and measured the day with cords and sticks. Pause. Clay hardened into soldiers. Armor became patterned tiles. Eyes were no longer flesh and iris, but small black points. And yet those tens of thousands of points made the living shiver as though surrounded by a silent army that would never tire, drilled in an obedience stricter than that of any garrison. Pause. Tradition insisted that rivers of quicksilver flowed in miniature within the mound, that constellations were mapped on the ceiling for the late emperor's unblinking gaze, that traps were set to punish the curious. Pause. The truth may have been smaller or stranger, but the effect was the same. An entire landscape converted into an argument for control. Elsewhere, straight roads sent troops out like arrows. Carved edicts pulled thought into a mold. Indifference was packaged like evidence awaiting the torch. The empire learned to walk in step in order not to be noticed. And even festivals were trimmed, their dances straightened, their masks explained, until no one needed to ask what they meant. Some say that, in panic at rumor and doctrine, scholars were buried to still the mouth of rationality. Others say the scale and detail were amplified by later pens working to blacken a legalist age. The debate does not soften the edge that people felt under their fingernails, which was the edge of being measured every day. What gave the age its demonic undertone was not a lurid rite, but a cold perseverance, a will to replace hearts with measures and maps, to turn questions into true-false drills, to make history a corridor where every door opens onto the same room with the same seal. Pause. The bureaucracy learned to be exact as a blade learns to be sharp, and punishments were designed to be exemplary the way milestones were designed to be visible from the road. Pause. While the empire was young, he used fear as mortar to fill cracks in variety. When the walls stood firm, he added more layers, because fear never left once invited. Pause. It is said his death was concealed on a tour, so as not to disturb the machinery, that carts of fish were ordered to hide the smell. and that the procession rolled on while decrees still went out in a dead man's name. Flickering. Pause. Whether the details are embroidered or not, the picture is clear enough. The machine preferred continuity to truth. Under the night vault of the capital, among torches that breathe orange and gold, the emperor's silhouette walked like a giant wooden ruler measuring the world. And with each step, the horizon slipped farther away, leaving behind a land scraped clean. So clean there was no place left for a whisper. If you listened from the shadow of a colonnade, you could hear the empire breathe in a controlled rhythm. Census, levy, inspection, decree, all the way down to the way cords were tied and seals were pressed. Pause. This too was a sort of wonder, but it was the wonder of a closed fist that could lift a mountain by squeezing it into shape, and of a silence so complete that even praise sounded like compliance. Pause. In the long run, such strength leaves a bruise even on memory. The army of clay, patient and unsleeping, still stands to remind anyone inclined to forget that the first emperor made both a country and a lesson, and that both lessons, glory and dread, were taught in the same classroom. Pause. By the time the empire passed into Han hands and put on the robe of civil culture, another fever had begun to creep from the inner chambers, a dread of things that could not be seen but could nevertheless be punished. Pause. Emperor Wu enlarged frontiers with sword and bow, scattering the Xiongnu and planting new commanderies like posts in the steppe. Yet within the palace, he widened the perimeter of anxiety with cases named for charms and spells. Pins pressed into wax, odd scripts on silk, muttered rites behind fans that smelled of cedar and perfume. Pause. If a ruler believes threats come not only from borders, but from shadows in men's hearts, then those shadows will be dragged into the sun on chains, and dragged they were. Officials, kin, servants, even those who had laughed with the emperor in the gardens where cranes were kept, could be pulled into the spinning wheel of investigation. Pause. Every confession became a thorny twig woven into a crown of punishment for someone to wear. Every denial hinted at deeper stealth. Every whisper required 3 more whispers to clarify it. In halls still thick with incense, confrontations ran on like sleepless nights, and by dawn, exhaustion did not soften suspicion. It made suspicion feel normal, like a curtain that was always drawn halfway across the window. The archives filled with testimony that sounded alike, the way reeds sound alike in a wind, and the wind did not stop until it had convinced everyone that silence was a sort of armor. Alongside that invisible fear, a very visible machine was kept oiled and humming. Total mobilization. Long campaigns against the steppe confederations, gray-green walls crawling over ridges in careful arcs, relay stations dotted like beads across dry country, and granaries rising like cliff hollows in river towns were the scaffolds of grandeur. Pause. Chroniclers wrote of triumphs and sacrifices to heaven. The ink was mixed with dust and sweat, the thud of cartwheels, the snap of silk shoulder straps cutting into flesh, and drums that marked roads as surely as milestones. Pause. The emperor loved big things. Great music with orchestras of bells and stones. Great rites whose choreography placed every noble in a measured arc. Great preparations whose ledgers ran for pages. And big numbers always demanded small sacrifices, repeated until those sacrifices turned into ground you could walk on. Pause. Villages accustomed to reading the year by plum blossoms learned to read it by quotas. Men accustomed to counting cattle learned to count lengths of wall. Women who had memorized their lanes by the hush of hawkers learned to memorize distances to granaries and depots where their sons were stationed. When policy reached this deeply into everyday time, it did not arrive with a crash. It arrived with a calendar. In a court intoxicated with scale, dissent sounded off-key. Scholars who had longed for a Confucian softening of rule discovered that the softness would be a velvet overlay on bronze. They adjusted their quotations accordingly, praising benevolence with one breath and logistics with the next. Pause. The witchcraft panic waxed and waned, sometimes crashing through the gates like a sudden flood, sometimes retreating into channels of rumor. But the bed it carved remained. Rooms became habitually airless. Conversations turned habitually to flowers if footsteps approached. Paws sleeves were habitually inspected before anyone dared to speak. Outside, supply lines continued to run like arteries, feeding operations longer than a planting season, and common people learned to fit their lives around drum beats the way they once fit them around rains, planning marriages between levee periods and funerals between transport seasons. Pause. The dynasty endured and borders widened, but inside the breast a small shaded courtyard remained, somewhere to hide a question that should not be asked aloud. Is safety bought with fear truly secure? And what kind of loyalty grows in ground, watered by apprehension? It would be unfair to paint the age only in iron colors. Schools flourished, the classics found their imperial sponsor, and civil ideals received altars next to military ones. Poets described the moon over frontier forts with tenderness and fatigue. But the demonic undertone persisted precisely because it was not a spectacle. It was a habit. Once the court learned that the unseen could be prosecuted with the same vigor as the seen, it acquired a taste for the efficiency of intangibles. Intent became as chargeable as act, rumor as consequential as deed, and moral rectitude as quantifiable as grain. Pause. The chariots rolled on. The registry grew. The rites were performed with impeccable timing. And at the end of the day, even the emperor, who had pushed the edges of the map outward, walked back into rooms where the lamps burned very steadily and the attendants kept their eyes on the floor. For steadiness and lowered eyes made a fortress in miniature. Pause. That was the paradox of the reign, that greatness could teach caution more effectively than fear, and that caution, taught so well, could harden into a shell from which a different kind of anxiety hatched generation after generation. Pause. In the brief years of the Sui, one work bridged centuries, a man-made waterway that pulled north and south together, a long liquid tendon people would still call grand 1,000 years later, though its grandeur depended as much on bodies as on engineering. Pause. Emperor Yang stood over maps like a craftsman over fine timber. He wanted to carve a straight line into the earth, and to do it, he borrowed the hands of countless subjects who could not refuse the loan. They dug until their palms were polished with blisters, carried until their shoulders learned a new slope, lifted until lifting felt like the default position of the back, and died until death itself was merely another transfer of weight. Pause. Others replaced them. The canal lengthened like a tail that refuses to finish, and the overseers measured progress in spans of human endurance as if endurance were a natural resource. On the surface, dragon barges slid as smoothly as a court historian's praise. Flags fluttered like minor chords in a deliberate music, and the emperor's tours proved the idea that the state could move as elegantly as a swan. Pause. Below, the silt was as muddy as the answers of tired shoulders, and the reeds along the banks learned to whisper a single thought in many dialects. That water was being taught to serve while men were being taught to disappear. The canal was not only a brag, it was a logistical artery that promised the North rice and the South soldiers on a schedule that cared little for weather. Warehouses sprouted like sensible square mushrooms along the banks. Lock gates creaked. Ferries multiplied. The price of certain goods dipped and rose with the emperor's itinerary, as if markets too were conscripts. But he was not content to rule where the canal ran. Campaigns hammered at the stone wall of Goguryeo to the northeast. Each hammer blow a season, each season a generation aged before harvest. Each generation a ledger entry for which no compensation could be paid. Pause. On river flats, banners threw long shadows like oaths. And in village fields, people cut grain early to March, leaving pestles laid crosswise on the floor as small symbols of interruption. Pause. The arithmetic of these expeditions looked handsome in the planning chambers, arrayed as they were in columns, but arithmetic performed on people produces a remainder that cannot be erased. It lingers in doorways and in the way names are spoken, and in that remainder, the dynasty began to pay a debt it did not believe it owed. When expeditions failed, the court misread the map of damage. Defeat was not only a dot on a frontier, but a notch in the public spirit where loyalty had once fit snugly. The capital stayed bright, its avenues straight as proverbs, its pavilions persuasive, but light multiplied the darkness between lamps. And in that darkness, whispers learned to be short, neat, and direct. Tyranny. Pause. A state that had mastered straight lines began to discover that discontent prefers diagonals. It cuts across squares and meets itself around corners. The emperor loved big script, long water pageants, retinues dense as groves, and every love demanded a flat, quiet portion of blood from those who would never stand beneath the eaves of the great halls. He counted that sacrifice as civic culture and liked the hush of it. Huang. Pause. He also liked the hush of roads being widened, of relay stations refurbished, of a court moving with punctuality. Punctuality is a cousin of virtue in such systems, and soon the court could arrive precisely on time to places that no longer wanted to receive it. What felt demonic about Emperor Yang was not private sadism, but an ease with the abrasion of human life in the name of grandeur, a habit of confusing spectacle with substance and obedient motion with consent. He toured in glory, he measured in triumph, he spoke in absolutes. Meanwhile, farmers recalculated their seasons against the pull of construction sites and war roads, and mothers recalculated their lullabies to account for sons who would sleep beside ditches rather than hearths. Pause. Once the canal was finished, it proved two things at once: astonishing capacity for organization and a systematic talent for forgetting. A kingdom that can make water climb steps and descend on cue can also persuade itself that the cost was not extraordinary. And in that persuasion lay the seed of collapse. Pause. For the same water road that carried rice north could carry news and resentment south, rapidly, efficiently, like cold moving through a house with excellent ventilation. When the dynasty tilted, it tilted quickly. Straight lines, after all, make excellent runways. The barge that had symbolized command became a symbol of flight. The locks that had proclaimed mastery needed guards to keep them from being mastered by others. In the end, the canal remained, useful, beautiful in its way, a shin of jade set into the country's leg, and the name of the man who had forced it into being remained as well, but varnished with a lesson none of his celebrations ever intended to teach. Pause. An empire may supply itself with almost anything except time to mend fissures carved into its people, and when time is denied its scale, it returns with interest. Travelers along the banks in later centuries admired the engineering and nodded at the convenience, and some of them felt a little colder than the breeze warranted, as if the reeds retained a memory that water could not wash away. Pause. In the cool mornings of Chang'an, when dew clung to the green-glazed tiles and the city's avenues stretched straight as a recited line of verse, the imperial palace breathed with a rhythm the outer wards could only guess at. Pause. Into this inner world walked a woman whose footsteps began in the quiet domain of attendance and ended on the dragon throne itself. Wu Zetian did not arrive as a sudden storm. She came like a season that first touches leaves at their edges, then finds its way down the veins, then teaches the tree a new calendar. She learned the court's grammar at ground level, where the meaning of a pause could outweigh the meaning of a sentence. And then she spoke that grammar back to the court with a precision that both dazzled and unnerved. Pause. In rooms where curtains softened voices, she saw how words could be sharpened into instruments, how reports could be tuned to a key the listener already favored, and how a title, once separated from the person wearing it, could be set gently on another head while everyone applauded the smoothness of the transfer. Pause. The Empire would later argue about whether she was an exception to the rules or the final proof that the rules themselves were more flexible than advertised. But while the argument prepared its evidence, she carried on with the business of governing, and those who served near her learned to measure their sentences as a merchant measures gold dust, carefully and with eyes lowered. The machinery that supported her ascent never announced itself as machinery. It presented as concern for order, for heaven's favor, for the clarity of lines in a painting whose subject must be recognizably upright. Omens and inscriptions were not merely divine punctuation. They were stage lighting adjusted to flatter a new protagonist. And if the audience felt a little blinded, that could always be attributed to excessive piety. Pause. She commissioned texts and sponsored sutra that read like letters of introduction from heaven, not shrill but steady, as if the cosmos had long ago made its choice and was now patiently reminding those who had misheard. Pause. Within the ministries, a careful selection of officials, the attentive, the watchful, the kind of minds that remembered not only what was said, but how it was said, became the connective tissue between will and act. Pause. Their memoranda were never dramatic. They were orderly, practical, persuasive, and they always placed the proposed measure into a moral frame where resistance felt like neglect. Courts, like orchards, need pruning. Weeds, like errors, spread faster than anyone expects. To such music, even hard notes sounded responsible, and a listener could easily forget that responsibility, when amplified, can drown out mercy. Her reputation for severity grew not from theatrical cruelty, but from the unruffled way consequences followed decisions, like a shadow that never hurried, yet never failed to appear. Rival branches of the imperial family found themselves described with adjectives that dim their luster. A certain look in a certain quarter could be transcribed, months later, into a doubt about loyalty. And a doubt, if left in a warm drawer, could ripen into action with an odor of inevitability. Pause. The law, that ancient garment the empire mended and rehemmed each reign, fit closely in her time, and the tailor's hand was known to be firm. Informants, call them listeners with notebooks, did not stand behind screens with a villain's grin. They attended, they recorded, they summarized, and their reward was to be confirmed in their conviction that attention itself was a species of patriotism. When punishments came, they came with an explanation and a seal, and it is the nature of explanations with seals to quiet questions before they have learned to speak. The demonic tint of this order, if one insists on the word, lay in its calm. The palace learned to remove a name from a genealogy with the same composure a gardener removes a blighted twig from a favored tree, not out of malice, but to preserve symmetry. Yet to paint the rain only in shadow is to miss why so many found the picture compelling. Examinations were nurtured, scholars advanced on merit more regularly than before, and regions neglected by previous regimes heard the hoofbeats of attention, sometimes in the form of relief measures, sometimes in the form of tax collectors who had finally been given maps. Pause poetry threaded through the court like a second language. Temples saw patronage that made their eaves shine again, and in public proclamation, one sensed an intelligence unwilling to be satisfied with the old summary that order must simply be inherited. Pause. What disturbed some had a paradoxical comfort for others. Decisions were made. The empire's surface was combed, timetables were kept, and the peripheries were reminded that the map included them. In the hush after an edict was read aloud, a hush that always follows sentences with large consequences, even critics could taste the relief that comes from knowing which way the river would run this season. Pause. If harmony was sometimes purchased at the price of a certain quietness in people's throats, harmony still rang, and the streets at night in Chang'an were known to lie peaceful under lantern light. Still, the palace's shadow was real and had the texture of paper, documents, affidavits, transcripts, because paper, when stacked, acquires the weight of stone. A sovereign whose legitimacy required exquisite framing could not afford indifference to rumor, and so rumor became a taxable commodity. It was collected, assessed, and, if necessary, corrected with penalties understood by all. Pause. Confession was not always a rope in the throat. Often it resembled a path back into favor for those willing to learn the new names of old virtues. And if some discovered the path was shorter for the nimble than the faithful, that discovery was written down and filed too. Pause. When on certain winter nights, frost limbed the lacquer screens and the lamps burned very still, one could imagine that power, in this particular reign, had been taught to sit without fidgeting, to keep its back straight, to breathe evenly, as a disciplined singer warms a note until it fills a room without cracking. Pause. That poise kept the realm steady through shocks that might have splintered a looser grip, and it convinced more than a few that steadiness is itself a moral achievement. But poise can teach a habit that is hard to unlearn. Officials who survived by judging the wind's temperature with near scientific care found themselves unable to relax even after retirement. Families who learned to keep their conversations in the courtyard, where the sky is a sort of witness, strained to maintain that custom when they moved to smaller houses. Pause. The storytelling in later years multiplied both the sins and the miracles, as storytelling always does, and history, which dislikes leaving a powerful figure in peace, wrote chapter after chapter in which the empress was alternately a savior and a scourge. Pause. What remains, if one sets aside the tallest tales, is a picture of governance that prized coherence so highly it sometimes mistook variety for error, and a memory of a ruler who understood that names could be weighed, that words could be cut to measure, and that a country can be kept quiet by teaching its heartbeat to follow the metronome of the throne. Pause. In the final accounting, her reign sits on the shelf of paradox, both a widening and a narrowing, both a promise that merit matters and a warning that closeness to power can erase a decade of virtues with a signature. Pause. And if passing through the old capital, you feel the air along certain corridors grow cooler, it is perhaps because the building still remembers what it meant to make the empire breathe in time. Pause. The founder of the Ming stepped onto the stage from the far edge of society, carrying in his bones a memory of hunger that no banquet ever fully erased. A boy who had watched roofs sag and families disperse under plague and war. A novice who had learned the plain discipline of monastic bell and bowl. A rebel who had felt the wind of fires he did not set. Zhu Yuanzhang pledged upon victory to build a state so solid no peasant would again sleep with one eye open. He prized work that could be seen, walls repaired until they looked like the country had been combed, granaries full enough to dull the edge of winter, office titles fitted to duty like tools fitted to hands. Pause. The tone of his early proclamations was the tone of a village headman who has been given a city to manage. Direct, impatient with frills, obsessed with the simple honesty of measured labor. Pause. He spoke of rectifying names and restoring households as if each were a tile that, once properly placed, would teach the roof above it to resist weather. The empire answered him with a deep relief that sounded almost like applause. Here was a ruler who remembered the price of chaos because he had paid it in days and nights, not just in lines on a scroll. Yet the memory of chaos, when it lodges too firmly, has a way of multiplying locks. The founder trusted his own eye above the inherited structures of council, and when advice felt like hesitation, he wondered whether hesitation concealed something darker. He set about simplifying the government's diagram, reducing layers that, in his opinion, allowed blame to leak away. The diagram did indeed grow clearer, but clarity made every blot stand out. Pause. Corruption, to a man who had begged his way across provinces, did not resemble a technical defect. It resembled betrayal, and the punishments he ordered reflected that heat. Codes were composed in unadorned language so the meanest village could understand where the pole of the tent stood, and offenders learned quickly that the pole, once shaken, struck back. Pause. His court became a place where the memory of famine sat beside the throne like a silent advisor, nodding at each decree that promised to keep granaries honest and officials lean. Pause. The result was an early Ming that felt scrubbed. Taxes were counted, acres registered, families squared into units the state could both assist and compel, and for a time the countryside's breathing grew regular again. But arithmetic, once invited into the heart, counts everything, even the angles of a glance. The emperor, vigilant by habit and reinforced by stories of betrayal that reached him like brittle twigs snapped underfoot, began to see the possibility of conspiracy as a sort of weather pattern, not always present, but always possible, forming at the edges before anyone could name the cloud. Sort of terrain of pause. Large cases flowered from small suspicions. Names that had once been printed in public praise were suddenly circled in red ink, and men who had stood shoulder to shoulder in victory were required to explain, over many pages, the mathematics of their loyalties. Pause. The trials that followed were not carnivals of gratuitous cruelty. They were meticulously staged reckonings that sought, above all, to map networks, as if the discovery of every link would once and for all prove that there was, in fact, a single route from which danger sprang. Pause. Those maps, like most maps drawn in fear, expanded to fill the available paper. The demonic hue of this vigilance lay in its scope. A net large enough to catch sharks will also catch the occasional moonbeam, and it is not always clear to the fisherman which is which until he has already tightened the cord. He did not rule only with punishment. In those years, he insisted on frugality that made courtiers shift in their robes and count their ornaments twice before wearing them. He demanded that proclamations be written for comprehension, not for flourish. He sent inspectors whose brief was to look under the rugs of the realm and report whether dust had gathered. Pause. He attended to agriculture as a patient attends to breath, reminding counties that irrigation ditches are worth more than vases, that seed grain must be protected from celebration, that the road's condition is a report card on the magistrate's conscience. Pause. Veterans received land with obligations attached, not as an indulgence, but as a reintegration. Widows and orphans were counted aloud so they would not vanish into euphemism. This permanent attention hardened into an ethic. The state would stand not because its poetry was beautiful, but because its ledger was honest. It was a strong ethic, and many slept better for it, until they realized that an ethic can, in certain temperatures, turn into a verdict. The founder's distrust of intermediaries cost him counsel that might have softened the edges of his fear. The institution that once balanced imperial will with a stabilizing second voice lost its footing, and in the silence that followed, whispers learned to carry farther than arguments. When his gaze fell on the past, a past of collapse and invasion, it ached like an old wound in cold weather, and he believed he could prevent re-injury by binding the joint so tightly it would never flex again. Pause. Families, sensing the empire's new preferences, trained their sons to be unobtrusively competent rather than dazzling, for brilliance attracts both promotion and lightning. Villages, sensing the inspector's taste, learned to place their neatest fields along the road and to hide their untidiness behind modest walls. Pause. To live under such a ruler was to learn the discipline of straight lines, to speak clearly, to keep accounts square, to mistrust shortcuts even when they promised mercy. It was also to live with the knowledge that the emperor did not divide the world into friends and enemies so much as into helpers and hazards, and that a helper could, by one misstep, become a hazard in need of removal. In old age, he remained what famine had made him, sharp, unsentimental, and unwilling to confuse softness with care. He left to his descendants a state that could count itself, a countryside that, while tired of inspections, preferred honest tiredness to the panic of years when the taxman arrived with soldiers, because the previous taxman had disappeared. Pause. He also left a shadow shaped like a question. How much suspicion can a system absorb before it begins to suspect itself? And what ritual can purge a fear that presents as virtue? Pause. Later generations would amplify the blood in the stories, as later generations always do, and they would quibble about statistics and motives, but the core remained sturdy. This was a reign that tried to teach the lesson that order and fairness are twins, and then discovered that the twins sometimes quarrel. If you stand on the city wall he rebuilt and watch the plain roll away in neat patches of earth, you can admire the steadiness that replaced a broken century. Pause. If you listen a little longer, you may hear another note underneath, the scrape of a pen circling a name, the rustle of a list lengthening by one, and you will understand why those who served him learned to love daylight and to dread the moment just before dusk, when the day's last report was carried toward the seal. Pasunam. He began as the Prince of Yan, fourth son in a house crowded with promises, stationed at the empire's chilly forehead, where the steppe pressed its breath against the wall. Pause. In that air, he learned the grammar of sudden rides and careful silence. And when his nephew ascended at Nanjing under the name of benevolence, the new emperor's attempt to prune uncles from the garden of power reached north like an early frost. Pause. Judy mounted the correction he called Jingyan, the pacification of disorder, and rode south behind banners that carried explanations as well as orders. Bridges burned, gates learned the flexible meaning of allegiance, and the capital's sky reddened in a way that later storytellers would never allow to fade. When the smoke cleared, he took a new reign title, Yongle, eternal happiness, as if promising the country a balm that would outlast the sting that delivered it. And he did what conquerors in robes always do. He set out to build something so large that it would explain the past by dwarfing it. Pause. The court whispered about loyalty and legitimacy. The empire, being practical, asked for grain routes, defensive lines, and a schedule for taxes. By then, he answered with a plan of motion that would make the state feel like a single long corridor connecting frontier and throne. He made Beijing the axis around which that corridor turned, and to do so, he instructed men to move mountains one brick at a time. The Forbidden City rose with a measured patience that concealed the ache beneath the scaffolds. Teams pacing like pulse beats, timber creaking like old proverbs, glazed tiles cool to the touch at dawn, and hot enough at noon to warn careless hands. Pause. The plan was not only architectural, it was ceremonial cartography, placing altars where heaven and earth might be consulted, with an etiquette so exact that even the wind felt rehearsed. Pause canals were dredged and straightened to feed a hungry northern capital. Warehouses grew along their edges with the same rhythm as reeds, and somewhere behind the numbers, an official counted backs. How many would bend? How many would not return? Pause. In winter, the north wind tested the eaves, and in summer, citrus and tribute rice arrived upriver under banners that gave the impression that time itself had been enrolled as a porter. Pause. The new city made an argument in brick and lacquer that the realm's face should be turned toward the steppe watchfully, and that within the walls thought should flow toward one seat smoothly. Pause. Glory has a tone, and in Yongel's court it sounded like drums from the Meridian Gate at first light. Precise, carrying, never hurried. He knew that splendor without certainty is only costume, and so he set certainty to work with tools that carve fine lines and deeper shadows. The Jinyue, soldiers in embroidered uniforms who had learned under his father to be an emperor's quick hands, were given new confidence. The eastern depot of eunuch surveillance, spun out like a web from palace silk, learned the art of being everywhere without appearing to move. Poursturi, pause. Informants and interrogators are not an exotic species. They are clerks who have been taught that conscience is identical with obedience, and the files they kept multiplied like a second kind of library. Paris, pause. The case of Fang Xiaoru, scholar who, asked to draft an accession edict, refused with a single stubborn character, was told and retold not only for its tragedy, but for the geometry of its warning. That refusal, even elegant refusal, could be interpreted as a disease with many vectors, and that the cure might seek out not only kin, but students and colleagues, as if ideas themselves had family trees to be pruned. Pause lists lengthened in a tidy hand. Seals clicked. The hush of the city at night included the soft tread of men carrying papers, as well as the clatter of carts carrying rice. The demonic shade of the rain lay not in gory spectacle, but in the way suspicion learned to wear a civil face, in punishment learned to arrive with a citation attached. Pause. If a man's loyalty could be mapped, then disloyalty could be mapped too, and maps, once drawn, beg to be corrected until they satisfy the eye. Yet he understood that fear alone is a poor cement. The mind, like the body, prefers to be fed. He summoned scholars and set them to compiling the Yongle Dadian, an encyclopedia that aspired to weigh everything written and find a place for it on the shelves of the empire, as if saving texts were a sort of rescue mission for memory. Pause the project was a generosity and a command. Gather, copy, preserve, and do it in such a way that posterity could say the state had created a second brain for itself. Pause. Outwardly, he sent Zheng He in great ships that smelled of pitch and wind, their decks bright with pennants that treated the Indian Ocean like a lacquered tray on which new tributaries might be politely arranged. Pause. The voyages brought back giraffes and spices and letters that repeated what the court most wanted to hear, that the world recognized the choreography of Chinese centrality. And at the docks of the capital, the piles of strange goods made bureaucrats compose new categories with the delighted anxiety of men asked to name a color they have only just seen. Pause. The ship's wakes spread like ink on blue paper and then faded, as wakes must. But in the moment of their passing, they wrote a sentence that tasted like inevitability. All the while, the emperor monitored the oath he had taken with himself the day he took the throne, that no corner of the country would be allowed to develop its own grammar of loyalty. He campaigned north personally, not merely to move borders by a few ridgelines, but to teach the frontier that the throne spoke fluently in the dialect of dust and frost. Pause. He conferred with monks and Taoist adepts with a sort of pragmatic piety, seeking auspicious days for ungentle deeds and printing prayers with the same attention he granted to armorers' lists. Not because he believed faith would do the work of policy, but because he believed policy must be escorted by faith if it hoped to travel far. Some. Pause. In such a world, kindness was a matter of timing, and mercy, when it came, took the form of an instruction to remit a levy here, to rebuild a bridge there, as if the empire's good fortune could be tuned like a stringed instrument. Pause. Those who served him learned to keep their faces smooth, their ledgers precise, and their dreams modest. For the court was a place where a man could prosper by being necessary and perish by being noticeable. Pause. In the evenings, the Forbidden City absorbed the light slowly, and the red walls held the day's heat like a memory. The emperor, who had made that enclosure the country's heart, walked its courts as though pacing inside an idea. It was an idea of order so persuasive that later generations found themselves standing under its eaves even when the building had changed hands. Still, one cannot live entirely inside an idea without developing a certain thinness of air. In private, ministers discussed the cost of splendor in the language of repairs postponed, granaries weary, men who had served 3 tours before 30. In public, they praised balance and harmony with the graceful efficiency that comes from long practice. Pachori, the rain left behind artifacts that can be touched. The palace, the encyclopedia fragments, the bell whose bronze voice carries across centuries, and habits that are harder to point to directly. The habit of smoothing a document until it no longer has room for a question mark. The habit of equating quiet with consent. The habit of measuring a man by his usefulness in a crisis and measuring a crisis by how neatly it can be filed afterward. Pause. If there is a lingering chill in the otherwise warm prestige of Yongel's name, it comes from this marriage of magnificence and monitoring, from the way he taught the realm to stand straight, and in standing so straight, to hold its breath a little. Pause. Walk the central axis of his city at dawn, when the stones still remember the feet of guards and envoys, and you will feel the promise of a power that wanted to be both horizon and home. Listen at dusk, and you may hear the scratch of a brush adding one more name to a list whose perfection was always just an entry away. Handuan. Pause. He entered the throne room through a door that had never before been opened in exactly that way, and the hinges complained with a sound the Empire would come to recognize. Pause. A collateral prince called in by death and necessity, Zhu Haokong met the etiquette of succession with a new arithmetic. His own father, a minor prince who had died far from the great stage, would be elevated and honored as the proper ancestor to whom the new emperor owed everything, and those who urged him to bow to the adoptive fiction that custom preferred would be taught the difference between ritual and truth as he defined them. Adori. Pause. The great rites controversy was not a skirmish over footnotes. It was war conducted in silken phrasing, and it rearranged the furniture in the palace of meaning. Ministers who had hitherto believed that remonstrance was a duty as noble as obedience discovered that their bodies could be addressed with argument as eloquent as any edict. Beatings in the court, demotions that resembled exile, and silences imposed so long that the men who wore them forgot the taste of public words. Tabrifuri. Pause. The emperor's victory was more than personal. It rewired the court's expectations. He had insisted that the empire adopt his family's grammar, and once the grammar changed, every sentence in administration was, in some small way, different. He found no pleasure in the morning lectures that had once been the pulse of Ming governance. During that season, he preferred the northern palace, the quiet architecture of abstinence, the calisthenics of fasting. Taoist adepts were admitted like drafts from a high window. They brought charts of the sky and the body, diagrams that promised victory over decay, elixirs that smelled faintly of the earth after rain, and also some whispered of metal. Pause. He studied in rooms where lamps burned with an almost scholarly steadiness, and where the topics were stars and breaths and cinnabar's secrets. The state continued to move because states, once set upon their rails, will do so for a time without a driver. Memorials were answered by men whose seals fitted the sockets of their offices, and tribute missions were received by function rather than by person. Pause. The emperor emerged to perform acts that could not be delegated, the sacrifices whose choreography ensured that the world continued to recognize China's fiduciary relationship to heaven, and then retreated again into a program of self-cultivation that was both discipline and appetite. Pause. Altars were built as handwriting grows, more confident, more elaborate. Courtyards whispered with the steps of officials who had learned the art of waiting. Outside, the coast grew noisy. Japanese and Chinese pirates, smugglers, and soldiers, in patterns too tangled to separate cleanly, worried the shore. Prefects wrote long reports in which the words urgent and lack recurred with uncomfortable regularity. Generals rehearsed excuses and then, sometimes, victories that smelled of smoke and salt. Pause. In the southeast, merchants dreamed in silver and awoke in rules. In the capital, silver pooled in pursuits that watched the hourglass more than the horizon. The emperor's priorities, ritual corrected, body perfected, did not banish the problem of ships sliding into coves by moonlight. And so the provinces learned again the stubborn craft of self-defense, that old Ming talent. Pause. In the fields, men counted seasons by repairs to city walls rather than by the condition of plows. In markets, women measured prosperity by the price of pepper and the presence of soldiers. The bureaucracy, resilient as bamboo, bent and did not break. But in their letters home, minor officials began to quote poetry about autumn more often, a sign, always, of tiredness. Inside, the emperor's search for long life hardened into a style of living that made time itself feel like a servant. He lengthened certain ceremonies as a musician holds a note beyond expectation, and he shortened audiences as a gate is closed politely but decisively. To serve in such a court was to edit oneself. To remonstrate was to practice calligraphy over a pit. The Taoist projects, the altars, the compounding, the labors of breath, were defended in memorials with learned references to antiquity, and it would be wrong to imagine only charlatans at work. Many believed sincerely that the body, properly tuned, could become a bell that rang so purely it would not crack with age. Pause. Sincerity, however, does not pay stipends, and while the North Palace inhaled incense, the outer ministries exhaled caution. The emperor rewarded those who brought him rare texts and rare ores, men who could speak of constellations as if they were neighbors. And the palace kitchens learned the recipes of restraint. Yet the larger kitchen of the empire, its tax granaries, its river transport, could not live on restraint alone. Pause. A ruler who eats very little nevertheless consumes a great deal of attention, and attention in a large realm is a currency as real as grain. Then came a night when the silences collided. In 1542, palace women, girls turned ghosts by the discipline of quarters, attempted to end the emperor's reign with a length of silk and a courage born of the kind of anger that has nowhere to go. Pause. The attempt failed, famously. It failed in a way that instructed the architecture, so that locks learned new habits and doors learned to trust only the hands they already knew. Paranoia. Pause. The emperor's retreat deepened, and the North Palace grew colder in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Eunuchs who had carried messages learned to carry suspicions. Women who had braided the hair of power learned the price of a knot tied in fury. The story was told afterward with the relish that scandal attracts, but its deeper moral was pedestrian. That neglect breeds fantasies of correction, and that fantasies, starved long enough, will eat their own makers. As well, he tightened the discipline of presence until presence itself felt like a privilege. The court's vocabulary adjusted accordingly, as vocabulary always does. The punishments that answered remonstrance were not random. They followed lines drawn in earlier fights over ritual, radiating outward like cracks from a struck bowl. Those who insisted on an older definition of duty were instructed by Cain and exile that duty includes the wisdom to be quiet at the right time. A few ministers discovered the emperor's gratitude for practical competence and enjoyed an interval of favor in which they achieved repairs that still show on maps. But favor under Jiajing was a patch of sunlight that moved quickly, and a man who stood in it too long risked a burn that did not heal. Pause. The calendar of the realm took on the temperament of its master. Long stretches in which nothing seemed to happen except the steady accumulation of small abrasions, punctuated by edicts that reasserted the correctness of a position everyone had already learned by heart. Pause. To the people who do not read court chronicles but read prices and weather, the reign was a composition in minor keys. To historians, it is a case study in how a sovereign can turn inward so thoroughly that the walls of his room become the walls of the state. And yet, even here, the label demonic is too simple if it is meant to indicate froth or frenzy. What chills in Jiajing's story is the coolness. The way he moved ritual until it fitted him, and then moved himself until he fitted ritual. The way he taught silence to be a policy, and then enforced it with a consistency that would have made a mathematician nod. Pause. Power, when concentrated in a room, does not vanish. It radiates through the building's beams and into the nervous systems of those employed to carry trays and documents. Under such radiation, the country learned again how to proceed without the daily warmth of an emperor's face. It proceeded by inertia, by the professionalism of 1,000 middling men, by luck, and by the capacity of villages to heal themselves between alarms. Pause. When the emperor died, he left behind altars that weather reclaimed and a collection of breaths taken according to formulae that outlived their user only in manuals. He also left a lesson drawn not from horrors but from absence, that a realm can be held together by ceremonies and fear long enough to convince itself that ceremony and fear are the same thing as care, and that over time, rooms that are too quiet begin to sound like caves. Plus, if you stand today in a side court where the stone is worn by the souls of men who waited there centuries ago, you will feel a draft that suggests the door ahead is still closed. Pause. The draft is history's, and it smells faintly of ink and of something metallic, as if the air remembers a recipe abandoned half complete. During that season, he was a boy who inherited a world of rules and set about discovering which ones would bend if he smiled at them, and which would snap and cut. In the beginning, the court mistook his energy for a season, spring in a palace that had known a long winter of discipline. And the boy-turned-emperor encouraged the misunderstanding, because seasons are forgiven their excesses. Pause. He liked uniforms, not merely as clothing, but as identities. He liked masks, not as disguises, but as permissions. He liked animals, not as curiosities, but as companions in a menagerie that made the palace sound at dusk like a distant forest. He named rooms for beasts and let the names leak into behavior, as names tend to do. By then, he rode at night with a handful of trusted men, calling himself by a title that allowed him to pretend he was his own servant, which is a sort of freedom only absolute monarchs can imagine. Pause. The city learned the feel of an emperor who blurred the line between pageant and policy. One day, a tournament of elaborately dressed guards on the inner parade ground. Another day, a whimsical tour beyond the gates in commoners' clothes that strained every protocol to keep danger at bay without insulting the sovereign's fantasy that danger did not apply to him. Pause. Ministers drafted memoranda that treated play with the grammar of statecraft, and play obliged by borrowing the grammar back, until the two could not be separated without tearing the paper. Eunuchs prospered in such weather as they do whenever proximity is worth more than principle. A circle of favorites, clever, attentive, shameless in the way only those who have survived the palace nursery can be shameless, learn to translate appetite into requisition and women to decree. Pause. Offices, like costumes, changed hands quickly. Revenue was found between the lines of law. Punishments were staged with enough ceremony to reassure the sober that the realm still knew left from right. Pause. A single favorite rose with such speed that the air whistled around him, and he discovered how much money a signature is worth when the emperor prefers stories to spreadsheets. Pause then, as quickly, He fell with a thud that shook the corridors, and the thud was explained with the old vocabulary of treason, the old choreography of confession, the old theater of exemplary death. Subu, pause. It is tempting to treat that rise and fall as a moral fable about corruption checked at last, but the deeper lesson belongs to physics. In a system where attention is the only real currency, men will mint it by any means, and the minting will be indistinguishable from governance until the bill comes due. Meanwhile, the emperor, who loved the feeling of a saddle as much as the feeling of silk, rode out to hunt in preserves designed to look like wilderness, and sometimes rode further, beyond the safe line, where mud is honest and water cold. Pause. His attendants, trained to anticipate desire, followed with tents, doctors, and explanations. He did not only play. By then, he liked the hush of drums that mean marching, and on at least one fine, ill-omened morning, he chose to be general as well as prince, riding toward a rebellion as if the empire were a stage, and he the actor who had finally accepted a serious role. Punto. Pause. There was courage in him, a real if unserious courage, the kind that makes a man smile at rain and wave at arrows seen from a distance. There was also the belief, common to the very young and the very powerful, that misfortune cannot occur at the center of the story. Pause. Campaigns that began with fanfare ended with mud, and the mud, being equal opportunity, clung to emperor and groom alike. Back in the capital, construction continued because construction is what courts do when they are trying to explain themselves. Pavilions added an extra echo to the lakeside. Animal enclosures multiplied until the court astrologer developed a second specialty in veterinary omens, and the palace acquired a taste for nights that sounded like festivals, even when they were only Tuesdays. Pause. The demonic tint of the rain, if one insists on the word, came not from a relish for blood. His pleasures were mostly salted with laughter, but from the way the structure of state bent itself around one young man's insistence that life be interesting, and from the way the bending pressed on people who had never met him in counties that would never see the capital's lanterns. Taxes are patient. They will wait until next year and the next. But every year, a man who pays them notices whether the collection is heavier or lighter. And under a sovereign who chases delights, the collectors have a way of arriving with lists that take longer to read. Soldiers noticed, too, that their boots wore out faster when orders were issued for effect and revised for comfort. Clerks noticed that memoranda grew longer when they were trying to describe events that dignified language was not designed to describe. Pause. Mothers noticed that their sons' letters from garrisons contained more jokes and fewer dates. On certain winter nights, servants found the emperor asleep where he had fallen, a boy with a crown dropped beside him like a toy, and the next morning the realm was expected to proceed as if sleep were also policy. Subreform. Pause. When he tumbled into cold water on a hunting excursion late in his short life, and rose shivering into the hammock of solicitous hands, the chill began a sentence that illness finished, and the palace, which had learned to inhale sharply whenever he left its walls, exhaled for the last time in a single long thread. Pause. The courtiers who had frowned their way through his pleasures composed eulogies that praised the same energy they had feared, because eulogies, like uniforms, have their required seams. The people who had paid for the fireworks and the repairs after the sparks fell nodded at one another in doorways as if to say that a chapter had ended and a different, quieter expense would now begin. What remains of him after stories have embellished him past recognition and moralists have trimmed him into a symbol is a portrait of power tempted by play and of a country resilient enough to endure being drafted into that play as scenery and audience both. The palatial menagerie is long gone. The rooms named for beasts are only rooms. The costumes have turned to dust in storage where glove-wearing scholars catalog buttons that once held a performance together. Pause. But the habits practiced under him are less perishable. The habit of equating novelty with vitality, the habit of handling accountability as a prop, the habit of letting surveillance be a sort of entertainment, until one morning it is only surveillance. Pour mes filles, pause. If you stand in a courtyard where his horses were once watered and listen to the echo under the tiles, you may hear neither sin nor heroism, but a charming, exhausting restlessness, and beneath it the soft scrape of ledgers balanced by men who did not dance. Pitosh. That scrape, more than any circus, is the sound the realm remembers, and it is the note that makes people call what they endure demonic. Not cruelty for its own sake, but the steady transfer of weight from a single man's curiosity to a million anonymous backs. Pause. He came to the throne as a child and, for a time, was raised by a tutor whose genius was administration rather than warmth. The early years of his reign bear the tidy fingerprints of a steward who understood that a country cannot be loved into health, but can be scheduled into it. Revenues were regularized, corruption pinched, transport lines tightened until grain knew how to move by calendar, and the empire, which had been exhaling irregularly, learned again the steady breath of a well-run household. Pause. Then time did what time always does. It made a boy into a man and turned a guardian's guidance into a weight. And when the guardian died, the weight remained, transmuted into memory and into the kind of resentment that appears respectable in ceremonial dress. Pause. The emperor looked around and discovered that the habits drilled into him, the morning audience, the polite scoldings exchanged with ministers as a sort of constitutional theater, the steady drip of decisions about matters that mattered only because last year's ordinance had made them matter, seemed less like the work of a sovereign than like a machine that had learned to wind itself. Pause. He wanted a different son named Heir than the one the textbooks of propriety recommended. He wanted the palace to smell less of old paper and more of a life he could call his own. He wanted, too, to test what the state would do if the hand that had been dressed as omnipotence simply declined to lift. What it did was reveal its true nature. For decades, the Ming moved forward as if the emperor were present because the to-do list remembered him, and the to-do list is a stubborn deity. Memorials arrived and piled, their respectful openings like frost on the same window every morning. Answers went out, sometimes with a seal, sometimes with a secretary's, often after a delay that turned urgency into bad temper. Pause. He ceased to appear in the Great Hall, then ceased to appear in smaller rooms, then learned to conduct his reign from within a sequence of chambers that grew with each year more like a private country. Pause. The word laziness is not quite right. It suggests a comfortable abandonment. What settled over him was something more like strike and sulk combined, a refusal to yield the one decisive choice, the succession to the consensus trade, and a refusal to be the front of a machine that had forgotten how to look sideways. Pause. Ministers wrote and pleaded and philosophized. They accused and begged and quoted the sages until the pages cracked with quotation. They performed the old duty of telling a king what kings dislike hearing, and received in return the long, soft answer of silence. Eunuchs, sensing the vacuum that all vacuums invite, carried messages past the lines of docketed procedure and learned the old art of converting proximity to power. The outer court, deprived of the daily theater in which its self-importance had always been confirmed, doubled its paperwork to prove to itself that it still mattered. Then the world knocked, loudly and from three directions almost at once. To the east, a war exploded on the peninsula, where sea and land conspired to make invasion possible. To the west and southwest, revolts and campaigns lit the interior like dry grass. Pause. The three great campaigns, as they would later be pedantically named, were not merely a mayoral headache. They were a test of the empire's ability to move men, food, money, and attention in quantities that would exhaust any treasury. Pause. Generals were appointed, dismissed, reappointed. Supplies were ordered and then discovered to be late or fictitious. The river transport groaned under more grain than its barges liked, and accountants discovered again the basic cruelty of columns when the numbers at the bottom disagree with hope. The emperor, who had withdrawn from the hall where such matters had traditionally been argued until heat dimmed to light, authorized and funded and frowned, but he did not return to the conversation in which a ruler hears mouths he would rather avoid. Pause. Coastal villagers watch their sons depart to settle someone else's quarrel across a strip of water. Frontier households learn new names for old anxieties. Merchants learn that silver is brave when it is advancing, but timid in retreat, and that taxes share exactly that character. Inside the palace, the logic of withdrawal hardened into the architecture of routine. He was no debauchee. He was a man who discovered that absence is a sort of power, and that power, once it finds a low-energy channel through which results still arrive, will prefer that channel for years at a time. Pause. Attendants learned the path of a paper from the outer gate to the inner room where the seal waited, and how to carry that seal back out with the minimum of fraying. Secretaries learned which phrases the emperor would accept without interrogation, and how to attach them to matters that needed decision. Pause. Censors learned how to scold by echo rather than by voice. Succession quarrel ran like a ditch through everything. Crossable, yes, but muddy, and men who fell into it came out marked. To serve in those decades was to master the art of the thrice-revised memo, to endure the ache in the neck that comes from bowing over trifles, to watch colleagues punished for intensity as if intensity were impertinence. Pause. The demonic aspect of the era lies less in violence than in the peculiar cruelty of being made to work seriously on a structure that its owner has set aside, as one might set aside a beautiful instrument, insisting that it continue to make music on its own. Yet the machine did, at intervals, produce genuine music. Victories were won by men whose names deserve better than footnotes. Reforms on paper kept certain regions from sliding into the ditch entirely. The cities maintained their quarrelsome prosperity. Scholars wrote elegant despair and taught diligent students who would become the next generation of elegant despairers. The emperor fathered children, argued with himself about them, watched courtiers argue about them, and finally made choices that satisfied nobody in full, which is the usual fate of choices made too late. Pause. He accumulated things, as men who stay indoors often do. Collections, projects, rooms where the light falls just so in late afternoon. He accumulated resentments too, and to the end could not quite forgive a country that had demanded so much while loving him so incorrectly. He died as emperors generally do, surrounded by caretakers whose faces were rehearsed into the appropriate mixture of sorrow and confidence. And the court that had trained itself to wait did the thing it had become best at. It waited a few days more, then changed the calendar with a crispness that must have felt to the tired like rain on dust. What remains of him is not a romance and not a warning whispered to frighten children. It is an X-ray of a system that could devour energy and produce order without the daily warmth of a sovereign's face, until the bill for deferred warmth arrives stamped with the price of morale. Walk through a museum and you may see a portrait labeled with his reign name, eyes heavy-lidded, mouth composed. The caption will talk about taxes and wars and silver, but the painting itself will teach you something smaller and truer, that power can be exercised by leaning away as well as by leaning in, and that both postures are expensive to everyone who must shoulder the slack. Pause. If you step into a side hall where petitioners once lined the stone with folded memorials and listen to the silence, you will hear paper, not voices, the weight of it, the rustle of it, the way it keeps existing even when eyes refuse to meet it. Pause. That is the sound that makes people, long after the fact, call the age demonic, because it is the hush of care turned into ceremony, and of ceremony slowly forgetting the name of care. Pause. He came to the throne in the hush after a very long reign, when a country learns to mistake continuity for immortality, and then discovers, abruptly, that time has rules of its own. Pause. The old emperor's many sons had spent years orbiting one another like anxious planets, and when Yinjin stepped into the center as Yongzheng, he did so with the posture of a man who has watched the weather from a sheltered porch and now intends to repair the roof before the next storm arrives. Pause. He was not grand in as a pageant is grand. He was exacting in as a ledger is exacting, and he wore suspicion like an undershirt, close to the skin, invisible from a distance, present in every gesture. His first act was not to build, but to tighten, to bind together the strands of decision that had frayed under a monarch who could afford to be expansive, to sink new nails where old boards had lifted, to teach the court that a good signature is one that can be traced directly to its consequence. Ponrekinom. Pause. Those who had expected a season of indulgence under a new ruler discovered instead the brisk air of morning, and it cleared their heads or made them ache, depending on what they had planned to ask for. He created closeness by shortening the path a paper could travel. The palace memorial, a folded sheet carrying a secret voice from field to throne, became the channel through which the empire whispered its rawest truths to a ruler who demanded them unseasoned. Pause. In those tight envelopes came accusations and confessions, totals and ratios, schemes and remedies. He read them as a doctor reads a pulse, with an impatience that is not unkind but refuses to flatter. Punter. Pause. The Grand Council took shape as a habit before it was a room, a small circle of men accustomed to decisions that could be made between breaths. They learned to speak the emperor's dialect of speed. Pause. Outside, governors and magistrates felt the weight of that speed in their bones. Grain lost to leakage reappeared under threat of audit. Transport schedules slipped less often. Bribes that had once been described as gratitude were reread as what they were, and punished in the tone of a man who cannot abide euphemism. During that season, he was not interested in theatrical cruelties. He was interested in the mathematics of deterrence. A few exemplars were chosen with icy care and flung into the well of rumor. The splash reached every yamen, and men who had thought of their posts as mills for private flour remembered that flour keeps better when shared. Reform with him meant converting custom into rule and rule into practice. He pushed through the long-needed shift that tied burdens to land rather than to grim proofs, relieving peasant households of a tax that multiplied with their children and encouraging the state to count fields instead of faces. Suriyirei. Pause. He regularized contributions that had been extorted as favors and named them for what they ought to be, transparent surcharges that supported specific expenses so that the empire's habit of begging under threat might be retired with a touch of dignity. Pause. He pursued the gentry who had learned to float above responsibility, not by denouncing status as sin, but by reminding status that it is a contract. County by county, the pattern repeated. A magistrate dismissed with a note clipped to his name like a tag on a broken tool. A collector called to account for deficits that had once evaporated in warm air. A sub-prefect who had run his district as an inheritance shown that the emperor did not recognize private maps. Poor. Pause. Even the banner households, the dynasty's armored kin, were told to live within means, and the message carried an undertone of blasphemy to those who believed birth exempted them from arithmetic. Pause. He was the sort of ruler who could praise thrift like a virtue and then measure it, who could speak of fairness without blushing and then send a man to the frontier for proof that he meant it. Severity found other theaters. Heterodox sects that promised shortcuts to salvation were handled as one handles dry tinder in a wooden city, quickly with buckets, and with a suspicion that smoke is a liar. Pause. Missionaries who had once practiced a negotiated accommodation with the throne discovered that the negotiation had ended. The line between rights and subversion was redrawn with a ruler's thin pen, and the new ink bled into villages that had sheltered new devotions. Pause. Literary crimes, words judged to hint at treason as a seed hints at a tree, were not always met with blood, but the threat of blood was never far from the discussion, and men who had once written cleverly learned to write plainly and keep their cleverness for the moon. Pause. He favored an empire in which the state's voice was the reliable one, and reliability, he believed, is born of fear almost as often as it is born of love. Pause. Censors were encouraged to bite like guard dogs, but to bite on command. Eunuchs were kept to function and reminded that proximity is not the same thing as authority. Princes were trimmed into dutiful relatives rather than rival sons. The palace ran like a clipped sentence, subject, verb, object, stamp, and yet the clipped sentence could convey care. He moved money to where the frost hit hardest, sometimes with a speed that surprised even the many frightened. He insisted that the poor be counted in numbers large enough to alter policy rather than adorn speeches. He preferred relief that arrived before petitions rather than after funerals. Pause. In a long correspondence with his empire, he played both father and auditor, and if the two roles sometimes contradicted one another in the minds of those below, in his they fused neatly. A father who loves you totals your accounts. Pause. He worked too much and slept too little, and the sicknesses that live in ink, stiff necks, hot eyes, a heart that learns to beat in the rhythm of reports, settled in with the familiarity of tenants who no longer bother to ask permission. Pause. He did not dazzle, he disciplined. In those years he did not charm, he compelled. If he felt lonely, he did not say so in a way historians could hear, but loneliness clung to his reign like the smell of smoke to a coat worn into a kitchen where oil spits. Pause. His death left an outline as clean as a solved equation, and even those who had feared the knock on their door at dawn admitted, under their breath, that the state had felt awake. People call such government demonic when they stand too long in its shadow or when the shadow lies over a friend. The demon here, if any, wore spectacles and asked for receipts. It prowled in the margins of documents, circling figures that did not add up. It waited in the courtyard outside the magistrate's office, where supplicants now found the window open. It listened at night to the river of secret memorials and found, in the current, both remorse and invention. Pause. The price of the order he achieved was paid partly in fear and partly in a quieting of the extravagant. The reward was an empire whose joints held a little longer than they might have, whose arteries carried grain and news with a steadier beat. If you walk today through rooms where he once wrote until the lamp gutters, you will hear paper breathing. It is not a comforting sound, but it is a sound that kept a very large house from collapsing in the dark. He inherited a system wound tight and humming, and discovered in himself a love of music that could ride that hum like a silk banner rides a wind. Early on, he was the best version of a long-reigning monarch, attentive without being brittle, ceremonious without being stiff, eager to collect the world's beauties and bind them into a narrative in which his dynasty appeared as both curator and author. Pause. He toured and wrote and inspected. He praised and punished in proportions that felt at first just. He smiled at craftsmen and named their perfections with an amateur's enthusiasm turned imperial by the power to commission endlessly. The workshops of the empire responded with a roar of competence, kilns that learned to mimic ancient glazes while inventing new brightness. Weavers who taught colors to submit to patterns so obediently that a robe could read like a story. Carvers who persuaded jade to admit that it used to be water. At court, compilations multiplied in the gentle light of patronage. Dictionaries and anthologies commentaries, and engraved classics. And finally, the largest of them all, a library that aspired to be a mirror in which the empire could see the totality of its thought. Pause. The project's neat shelves and even columns of characters gave off the aroma of permanence. That aroma is very persuasive. It can make you believe that time, too, has been cataloged. But books are also sieves, and the hand that edits is a hand that judges. While teams copied and bound, other teams searched and burned. Texts that smelled of dissent, the slightest whiff of nostalgia for fallen houses, the faintest suggestion that conquest had been a crime rather than a reorganization, were corrected out of existence. Authors were scolded, fined, erased. Families learned the odd sensation of standing before a shelf that had gaps where a grandfather's pride used to be. Shodiyorn. Pause. Literary inquisition gained a meticulousness to match the grandeur of the library. The larger the collection, the more conspicuous the absence. The more magnificent the patronage. The colder the refusal to tolerate grit in the porcelain. Scholars who had expected a golden age of argument learned to speak in footnotes, and footnotes, while elegant, do not startle a mind as a shouted question does. It is tempting to call this demonic, but the horror here was not theatrical. It was administrative, a bureaucracy of forgetting that sold itself as hygiene. He wanted a canon that felt like a well-tuned instrument, and he tightened the pegs until false notes could not be played at all, which is also a way of preventing new music. Outside the halls of culture, the map moved violently. Campaigns unrolled like carpets across the Northwest, where an older empire had once hunted, and where his banners now rode at a pace that made the steppe remember what it means to be pursued. Pause. Victories were proclaimed with drums and formal adjectives, but on the ground there were burned encampments and the long gray tail of displaced people. There were calculations made in a language the court did not speak fluently. Hunger, fear, revenge. And in that language, sometimes the emperor's glory translated poorly. Pause. The conquest of a neighbor's desert was called pacification. The extinguishing of a confederation was called the restoration of order. The empty places left behind were not named because maps prefer labels to silence. Farther south and west, hard country drove hard wars, and expeditions returned with stories whose endings did not always match the versions printed for the altars. To the south, there were campaigns that bled slowly and then quickly. To the southwest, mountains that swallowed brigades and returned only echoes. To the east and beyond the sea, an adventure that met a general in a plain hat and came home without its pride. 10 great campaigns, the toast said, great in size, in cost, in the appetite they trained. The treasury learned that triumph is an expensive delicacy. The soldiers learned that mountains and jungles do not salute banners. The emperor learned that a long reign has time for both genius and repetition is where errors grow comfortable. Trade narrowed and brightened in the same years. Foreigners were invited to one port and told in cordial terms that stiffened when necessary that the world would meet China where China preferred to be met. Guilds took on the task of mastering appetite. The ships would come and be measured, the goods would be weighed and taxed, and curiosity would be permitted within a custom-built garden whose walls were painted to resemble horizon. Pebri pause. Silver poured in, poured out, glittered in account books like a promise of infinite arithmetic, and then, unpredictably, stalled and sulked when winds changed oceans away. Merchants adjusted as merchants do. Officials inspected bales and pretended that history was a warehouse. The emperor wrote poems about foreign gifts with the careful bravado of a host who insists he has never been surprised. Pause. Meanwhile, the population swelled with a humane exuberance that delighted moralists and terrified logisticians. Rice fields multiplied their squares, villages merged at their edges after good harvests, and the ancient trick of filling bellies as a way to quiet voices worked. Until it didn't. until the next bad season, or the next tax demand, or the next requisition for troops reminded people that a full generation earlier, the state had promised to be father and accountant both. In the palace, a favorite grew fat, with a cleverness too supple to pin down and a loyalty too performative to be quite believed. He learned to turn an emperor's approval into a profession, and then into an industry. He developed a genius for arranging transactions between desire and budget, and for echoing with useful precision the monarch's most flattering thoughts. Shirigyu, pause. There are servants who become mirrors so polished that a master cannot see the room behind him, and in that glazed reflection, Hessian prospered. The emperor, rich in confidence purchased by decades of mostly correct instincts, tolerated the glint. To courtiers who had survived many winters, this looked like the old and simple story of corruption. To the empire, it felt like the new and complicated story of exhaustion, in which a sovereign's will, once plentiful, becomes a resource to be managed by those who can still stay up late. Pause. The accounts at the end of the long reign were not a famine. They were a thinning, an anemia masked by brocade. When the old man died and the new one measured the floor beneath the rugs, the dust was raised and the favorite with it. But dust is a cumulative substance and does not vanish with a single sweep. What remains of him is porcelain light and ledger shadow. If you hold a cup from his kilns, you will see a glaze that seems to have captured cloud and intention. If you read a poem he approved for the carving of a stele, you will hear a voice that loved the idea of harmony so much it could not bear the aleatory, the dissenting, the unsorted. Show pause. Walk, too, in lands folded into the realm by his banners, and you will find graveyards that do not appear in celebratory odes. Listen in libraries and you will hear a hush shaped by the works that are not there. Pause, he was not a monster. Monsters are easier to argue with. He was a great king in the most literal sense, and as the decades accumulated, he became what great kings often become. A man whose strengths overgrew their pots, whose garden was pruned until no weed could live, and no wildflower either, whose love of beauty encouraged him to sand down the splinters by which a nation sometimes climbs out of its habits. Pause. People call that tendency demonic because they felt in the end that the brightness was too even, the victories too narrated, the shelves too immaculate. On winter mornings, the Forbidden City still holds the thin, crystalline cold his painter's favorite for snow scenes. On summer nights, the willows still lean over water as if over a secret. Somewhere between those two seasons sits a ledger with every entry balanced and one huge omission written in invisible ink, the cost of wanting an empire to look perfect from where he sat. Pause. He began with a gesture that felt like fresh air after a long perfumed season. The favorite was taken down, the chests were opened, the ledgers were read aloud, and the man who had turned proximity into a mint was told, with a politeness that bit, to arrange his own death. Paudouis. The Great Purge was staged not as a spectacle, but as housekeeping. Rooms cleared, accounts balanced, a promise made that the floor would be visible again. And for a little while, the court remembered how to stand without wobbling on rugs layered 3 deep. Pause. The new emperor spoke frugality in a tone that made courtiers look at their sleeves before they entered. He preferred roofs repaired to pavilions multiplied. He liked the hush of river transport arriving on time more than he liked the hush of poems about river transport. The emperor dismissed, demoted, and redistributed until the palace ceased to glow like a furnace and began to hum like a kitchen. For those who had watched the previous reign's late indulgences with a mixture of reverence and unease, this was a tonic poured into the teacup of state. Even the portraits on the walls seemed to hang straighter. But a broom that sweeps too earnestly discovers, sooner or later, that the house has been built with corners. The corners revealed themselves as hills caught fire, and sex yet again promised quick ladders to a heaven tired of waiting. Rebellion never calls itself by its worst name when it is young. It calls itself correction or purification or relief. In the provinces where mountains complicate the grammar of marching, the White Lotus rose with the same old mixture of hunger, hope, and a leader's voice that sounds like a promise because it is learned by heart. Pause. The state replied with a policy that accountants could understand because fear loves a number. Bounty payments, stipends for proof that the countryside was being tidied of insurgents, a currency that taught soldiers and militias to measure loyalty in severed evidence. Pause. It was not designed to be cruel, it was designed to be clear. But clarity is a blade that cuts even the hand that wields it. Villages woke to find strangers' grim proofs labeled as their sons, and learned the math of survival in a season when proof could be manufactured as easily as guilt. Militia captains built careers on piles that could not answer back. Magistrates calculated the ratio of peace to paperwork and found that the curve improved whenever a cart rolled in with a load the quartermaster could count. Somewhere in the capital, the emperor read reports that declared progress in clean columns, and he authorized more rice, more silver, more men, because an honest ruler must believe that resources, properly applied, produce virtue. Pause. In the hills, the arithmetic of bounty taught a subtler lesson, that incentives once designed follow their own commandments with a zeal that mocks the catechism of mercy. He did not only punish, he rethreaded the net of responsibility to whole grain rather than throats. Contributions that had metastasized into local blackmail were pulled back into name funds. Taxes were asked for in tones meant to resemble requests. The gentry who had perfected the art of floating above obligation were reminded that titles are a sort of mortgage. The emperor encouraged the building of community granaries and the dull heroism of ditchwork, and on years when the monsoon remembered its promises, those policies looked like wisdom carved into earth. Pause. He trimmed palace expense, traveled less ostentatiously, and took pleasure in courtyards that sounded like industry instead of opera. It is possible to love such restraint, and many did. Yet the center's thrift arrived in counties as shortage of stipends, shortage of soldiers' boots, shortage of patience. And shortage, when it settles, breeds a style of administration whose voice is both nasal and desperate. Pause. In memorials written at night by lamplight that smelled of oil and onion, minor officials asked for rope, for wagons, for permission to move levies from one district to the next, for tolerance when numbers that had been neat on paper turned crooked in mud. Pause. The emperor answered as a conscientious clerk answers, with colored pencil and marginal notes, with rebukes that taught form, with a father's insistence that waste begins as a habit. Pause. In winter, he issued edicts like scarves. In summer, he pulled down mantles of exemption that had kept old families warm at public expense. Somewhere between those seasons, his face grew the look a man wears when he begins to suspect that the house he inherited was built on a spring. The spring was silver in the slow leak of confidence. Trade narrowed, foreign coins took long vacations. The treasury learned the discipline of saying no to projects that had once been padded with enthusiasm. As if the hill's insurgency were not enough, the sea developed its old taste for misrule. Pirates and smugglers threaded the coast in patterns that laughed at schedules. He authorized crackdowns that worked, then didn't. He promoted men who promised to be both stern and clean, and some were. He scolded a few into competence and discovered the ancient truth that a scolded genius resembles a sulking average man more closely than a reformed saint. During that season, he oversaw, too, the quiet files that thicken in any reign. Cases of heterodox belief handled as one handles sparks. Literary prosecutions that bore the stale odor of an earlier century, but still bit when applied. A permanent worry about words that dress themselves as loyalty to sneak past gatekeepers. In these, the demonic tint of his reign, if one uses the word to mean the way fear can be normalized, appeared not as spectacle but as office procedure. A sect crushed is a tidy sentence in a report. A rumor corrected is a moral victory with a receipt. A confiscation is a number that balances two columns. There were executions with the proper gravity, and there were pardons that tasted like clean water. There were arrests that made neighbors sleep easier, and others that made them speak more softly. The emperor kept his ledger and his conscience in the same drawer, and tried very hard not to confuse them. But a drawer, no matter how exact, cannot hold a country's appetite for meaning. He died having made the palace less gaudy and the ministries more alert. He died with rebellions amputated and resentments sutured. He died believing that a usable honesty is enough to keep a system upright. At court, he left to his successor a house swept to the corners and a broom with missing bristles. And outside on the steps, a drift of dust that always returns, because dust is simply what life becomes when it has been handled too often. Cruelty. He stepped into the room where restraint had already been arranged like furniture, and he rearranged it further. Fewer ornaments, fewer ceremonies beyond the necessary, fewer excuses disguised as festivals. Pause. He was not a man to be charmed by brocade. He was a man to be persuaded by a neat column of figures, by a canal that ran without complaint, by an officer who spent exactly what the regulation allowed, and not a cash more. Pause. He believed stubbornly and perhaps beautifully that a sovereign could bend the world by example. If the palace ate plainly, the provinces would learn thrift. If the throne spoke of rectitude, smugglers would blush. If the court revived severity against corrosive indulgences, the body of the state would recover its old appetite for virtue. This faith found its hardest test in a powder that arrived in cakes and dreams, in smoke that made men sit still while their lives curdled behind their backs. Opium had been a problem before. Under his watch, it became a character in the drama, a speaking role with lines that altered the plot. Silver, which governments prefer to believe obedient, learned to flow out of the realm as if it had been given legs. Taxes were still counted in books that assumed an older stability. Markets twitched like muscles asked to do one thing while the nerve commanded another. He looked at the drug and saw a moral fact that could be outlawed. The emperor looked at the foreigners and saw guests who had mistaken hospitality for surrender. He looked at his own officials and saw a mixed mural. Hands that trembled from habit, hands that reached for bribes, hands that were steady enough to carry out a hard sentence, if given a clean one. He chose clarity and appointed an upright man with a hard mouth to make the choice audible along the coast. The edicts were simple, the punishments unsparing, the confiscations put to death in the official voice that has so often mistaken itself for justice's own accent. Warehouses were forced open, inventories were made with cheeks clenched. The poison was poured into ditches as if the land could drink up a sin and grow better for it. For pause. In the ideal telling, this would have worked the way abstinence from extravagance sometimes works. A season of pain, a winter of muttering, a spring in which men find themselves surprised by their own clean breath. Pause. In the actual telling, which includes wind and cannon, and the peculiar frankness of ships that carry laws of their own, the bands collided with a world that did not merely disagree but possessed a navy. Pause. Local merchants had learned to translate risk into profit at an exchange rate that favored boldness. Local officials had learned to wear two faces and to argue with some plausibility that their duplicity prevented worse outcomes. Foreign captains had learned that a treaty means less to a hungry market than a well-aimed broadside. The war that followed was conducted in a grammar the court had forgotten how to speak. Speed, metal, the indifference of range. Soldiers who had trained to be brave at sword's length were asked to be brave at distances measured in seconds and splinters. Commanders who had mastered the mathematics of rations were handed the algebra of recoil. Defeat tastes like metal and then like paperwork. Indemnities were numbers first and then empty granaries. Opening was a word that sounded virtuous in edicts and drafty in warehouses. The ports, rearranged by ink and force, became mouths that required special feeding. Pause in the treasury, already exhausted by decades of wars inland, began to behave like an old man who hides coins in more pockets than he can remember and then accuses the furniture when he cannot find them. Pause. The emperor answered as a conscientious ascetic answers, by tightening, by instructing, by scolding forward and backward along the chain. He cut pleasures he had not taken. He regulated extravagances he did not enjoy. He ordered sincerely, repeatedly, that governors stop selling posts like produce and that magistrates rediscover the ethics that once fit them like a jacket. Meanwhile, in the provinces, people learned new measurements for the state's health: the price of salt, the speed at which copper cash lost its patience with silver, the time it took a petition to make the round trip to the capital and return with a stamp that might or might not alter the texture of a village's hunger. Pause. Droughts and floods, which care nothing for proclamations, punched holes in the season's fabric. Banditry, which is simply hunger with a knife, stitched those holes together and pulled at the edges. He tried other severities. Smugglers were made examples of on beaches where the tide erases footprints by evening. Addicts were punished as if their weakness were a rebellion in miniature. Censors were encouraged to bark at derelict officials until barking itself grew hoarse. Pause. The demonic feeling of the age, if one insists on the word, arrived not from the relish of cruelty, but from the automation of it. Penalties as a rhythm that could be kept even when the song had changed. The old legal drumming continuing beneath a new kind of war in a new kind of trade. Pause. He reduced the size of the retinue that followed him and found that retinues multiply like shadows anyway. He demanded savings and found that savings can be performed as theater while expenditures slip quietly out the side door. He tested ministers' character and found often that character is a function of weather. In those years, he was not blind. He knew a sinking when he felt the tilt under his feet. He also knew the perversity of systems that punish those who move first. A governor who improvises is a tyrant until the capital ratifies his improvisation, whereupon he is a loyal innovator. Pause. A general who retreats to save an army is a coward until the court decides to name him prudent, which it does only after he has been replaced. The emperor's frustration looks in the archive like ink that has been pressed harder than necessary into the paper. To be governed in those years was to be asked for patience as often as for taxes. The court's virtue, its determination to remain upright in a world that had begun to list, translated into village life as inspection, as levies that were explained as temporary, as men in threadbare uniforms who both protected and annoyed, as sermons about thrift delivered by officials who had learned to look clean in rooms that smelled faintly of mold. Pause. Merchants did what merchants always do. They learned the new borders, invisible or otherwise, and tried to make a living by moving things across them. Mothers did what mothers always do. They measured the state by whether it could protect a son's return. Scholars did what scholars always do. They wrote about the past in order to speak elliptically about the present, and the present, prickly, sometimes wrote back with a warrant. When the emperor died, he left behind a court that had memorized the motions of austerity and a country that had learned to hum responsibility like a lullaby to keep from hearing the sea. Pause. He was not the first to discover that moral clarity can make a ruler courageous and a state brittle. He was only the one in whose time the wind blew hardest from the wrong direction. What remains of him is the aftertaste of a sentence that was right in aim and wrong in method, and the memory of a face set in the expression of a man who is determined to be fair in a room that has run out of chairs. You can call the age demonic if you mean the way power, Cornered treats policy like a spell and punishment like a metronome. You can call it tragic if you prefer to count the ways a good intention can be led away by circumstance with its eyes still open. Pause. Walk along a surviving section of seawall that was patched in his time and listen to the water find the same old seams. Stand under a beam in a county yamen where a clerk once copied out edicts about virtue and contraband, and you will smell the faint combined odor of brine, ink, and long worry. Pause. That is the perfume of his reign, salt on paper, and it lingers because the paper, even after treaties and dynasties have changed, continues to record the same argument between desire and order, and to suffer the same quiet violence when the argument is decided by hunger. Pause. He was a child emperor whose reign name promised order. Tongji, ruling in harmony. Yet the harmony was a scaffold thrown up after a citywide fire, timbers still warm to the touch. Pause. The country he inherited had been gnawed by civil wars that turned provinces into moving camps and counties into rumor. The Taiping had cut a new channel through the social earth and then dried up, leaving mud and bones. The Nian, the Muslim rebellions in the northwest and southwest, the pirates who never admit their own names, all had taught the population to measure government not by sermon, but by the speed at which help arrived when the horizon darkened. Pause. The Regency in Beijing, led by a prince who learned to speak to gunboats without liking them, and by a dowager whose stillness had the gravity of stone, called the most capable survivors of the chaos to the workbench. Pause. Zheng Guofan, Li Hongjiang, Zhuo Zongtang, men whose biographies read like manuals on how to breathe through smoke, began to stitch a state back together with needles borrowed from whatever cloth was at hand. Militia traditions, merchant credit, the moral vocabulary of scholars hardened by siege, the grudging cooperation of foreign arms sellers who understood the grammar of cash better than the grammar of courtesy. Pause. It was called a restoration because the word suggests a return, a door reopening to a familiar room. In truth, the room had been rearranged by fire, and the door now swung on hinges supplied by men who charge interest. The method was practical to the point of ugliness. Where uniform armies had dissolved in panic years earlier, provincial hosts were raised by local gentry who could read the faces of their own villages. Where the old revenue arteries had been severed, makeshift veins were opened at checkpoints along roads and rivers to collect temporary duties that had a habit of becoming permanent. Where cannon could not be forged, they were bought and then copied with a craftsman's mix of pride and apology. Shirawanatunom. Pause. Arsenals rose, Jiangnan, Fuzhou, like new organs grafted into an old body, and their hammers rang with an optimism that sometimes mistook metal for destiny. Translators were trained with the quiet desperation of men who have learned that misunderstanding is a military liability. Shipyards learned to treat timber as though it were the future. The first telegraph lines looked like spider silk trying to catch a wind that still blew from an earlier century. The larger policy was called self-strengthening, a phrase that mirrors well in proclamations because it flatters both the self and the strength. But in practice, it meant an endless negotiation between what the court wanted to preserve and what the world now required be learned. Pause. Ministers practiced this negotiation as a monk practices breathing, daily without applause, aware that any lapse invites a demon whose face is not metaphorical, but wears brass and sails under a flag you cannot command. In villages, the restoration arrived less as a philosophy than as a new schedule of visits from men with lists. The lichened duties, improvised in war to make revenue rise where crops had fallen, multiplied into a lattice that turned travel into a conversation with ledgers. Each barrier had its rationale and its office. Each office developed a taste for continuity and dignity, which is to say for fees. Pause. Grain still moved, but it moved nervously, with documents tucked like talismans into sacks. Tea and silk still wove fortune out of green and thread, but the profit margin learned to count the hands it fed in transit. Officials, many of them tired to the bone, and more honest than later cynics allowed, found themselves presiding over a moral puzzle. The only way to repair government was to expand its reach. Shumari, pause. The only way to expand its reach was to tolerate, for a time, the small predations that keep a tired machine turning. The only way to cure predation was to reimpose a discipline that required money the machine could not produce without asking. A magistrate who looked clean at sunrise would have dust on his sleeve by noon, and by dusk a dozen petitions would have taught him that repair and harm often come braided. Hamanabian, pause. When the Regency demanded thrift, the ministries produced it in memoranda, and sometimes in fact. When the provinces demanded rope and rations, the center sent both and then asked for accounts written in a handwriting so steady it looked like virtue. Foreign legations settled like new stones in the city's riverbed, diverting currents that had once presumed to run unchallenged. Treaties drafted in the language of friendship and compliance operated in practice like mechanical devices. If the empire inserted grain here and silver there, markets would turn. If it refused, pistons would engage that did not answer to Chinese levers. Pause. Prince Gong, practical as a man whose house had already burned down once, coaxed a serviceable order out of insult by discovering, before most of his colleagues, that humiliation can be used as a building material if you are willing to sand it until it becomes unrecognizable. The Dowager, a better student of human timetables than of doctrinal maps, learned which audiences to grant and which to delay until the answer was functionally no. Shidi Yuam, pause. Their partnership was itself a scaffold, bolt, and plank. It creaked, but it held. Meanwhile, the boy on whose behalf they acted grew in rooms where instruction and awe mix into a diet that nourishes obedience more reliably than curiosity. His name was embossed on edicts that repaired roads he had never seen. His seal authorized punishments he did not witness. His presence in ritual was the promise that the world still ran from north to south along an axis fixed by heaven, though all the good maps now had insets showing railways the court had not ordered and customs lines the court could not erase. Demonic is a strong word for an age that saved so many lives by boring means. Yet those who lived under the Restoration sometimes used it softly, with a thin smile, to describe the way necessity talks when it has forgotten how to say please. Bounties on rebels encouraged the production of proofs by men who could not afford to be fussy about provenance. Loans to rebuild after sieges taught prefectures to love interest. Temporary conscription taught boys to walk in step until their feet forgot other rhythms. Pause. The new military discipline, which really was a gift to a land that had been terrorized by improvisation, also taught communities that their sons belonged to arithmetic. The arsenal's clocks kept time with foreign factories, and by doing so, taught the country that time itself could be purchased, maintained, broken, repaired, facts that monarchy had previously covered with myth. Pause. Schools founded to teach science and languages bred another habit, asking whether the purposes served by knowledge were always the same as the purposes demanded by ritual, and what to do on days when they were not. Pause. The court encouraged such schools and worried about them. The provinces paid for them and taxed them in jealousy. The students wrote in notebooks that now and then smelled of oil and sometimes of fear. If you stand inside one of the arsenal's old shells at dusk, you will hear the echo that all workshops keep, the beat of a hammer that is no longer there, and the sigh of someone counting parts. The Restoration scaffolds are long gone, planks reused, bolts rusted. But the marks they left on the walls taught the next generation where to hang new beams when the inevitable next storm arrived. Pause. Tongji himself did not live long enough to test whether his name could be more than a hope written on paper. The court he left behind had grown expert at acting for someone else. Pause. What remains is a memory of competence performed under a sky that would not promise good weather, and of officials whose hunger for order, for recognition, for revenue they told themselves belonged to the public, turned them into both heroes and tax collectors in the same week. Saputarm, pause. A house repaired in this way does not feel like a temple. It feels like a kitchen that has learned to keep the stew from burning even when the firewood is wet. Pause. People will call that demonic if what they wanted was music. But if what they wanted was sleep without the crackle of far-off gunfire in their dreams, the restoration gave them, for a few seasons at least, the kind of silence that could be mistaken for peace. Pause. He was another boy taught to hold his breath around authority, and the authority that defined his horizon was a woman who had already learned to outlast storms by becoming, to the public eye, a piece of weather. Pause. The arrangement, an emperor whose signature mattered, and an empress dowager whose glance decided when it would be used, was a compromise between myth and logistics, and for a decade it worked as a carefully balanced tray works in the hands of a practiced servant. Pause. Then the room changed shape. The sea slammed open doors in one direction as a new island power announced with gunfire that the map now responded to industries rather than to poems. The North grumbled in another as a rival empire with rails for veins began to look south with the frank appetite that always frightens old houses. Inside, clever men with clean hands and nervous eyes, Kang, Liang, and a constellation of younger scholars who had learned to pronounce state and nation in the same breath, convinced the emperor that the tray could not simply be held flatter, that the room itself must be rearranged while the dishes still stood upon it. Pause. The 100 Days was named as if resolve were a calendar. It was, in fact, an attempt to reorganize habit into policy. New schools where law and engineering might be treated like classics. Examinations trimmed of their calligraphic thickets so that a man might pass by knowing something a machine would respect. Ministries refitted for that hated word efficiency, which begins as a virtue and ends as a threat to anyone holding a comfortable chair. There was courage in the speed, the kind of courage that makes windows open in rooms that smell of ink. There was also the old arithmetic of risk, and in that arithmetic, the emperor's balance sheet was not flattering. He had titles and a conscience. She had the courtyard network, the professionals of delay, the craft of timing, the loyalties accumulated by a regency that had gotten used to being the grown-up in the room. Pause. The coup, rectification, say those who still think of it as a necessary shelving of dangerous glassware, arrived like a winter that has been forecast for weeks and still surprises with its first ice. Pause. A few reformers fled with bundles of books. A few were handed the vocabulary of treason and told to compose their own epitaphs by choosing which friends to implicate. Most learned within days how much of their enthusiasm could be repackaged as loyal service if they promised never again to try to move the furniture. The emperor's movement was confined to the dimensions of a small court on an island of stone inside a lake. The dowager resumed a throne she claimed not to want with a tired elegance that fit her better than any jewel. The palace had chosen itself over the country's experiments, as palaces often do, and it gave the country a lesson in patience that would not be forgotten. Outside the walls, patience snapped. The boxers, boys and men, apprentices and drifters, 1,000 micro-stories braided into a single, rough cable, treated railways and telegraphs as demons more literal than metaphor, treated missionaries as the sharp edge of foreign appetite rather than as a complicated mix of charity and curiosity, treated the court's weakness as a crisis that could be solved by muscle and trance. Pause. The court hesitated and then did what frightened governments always do when a crowd waves the right slogans. It mistook noise for capacity and romance for policy. Foreign legations barricaded themselves and wrote their names in a tone usually reserved for plays. Relief columns learned to talk to each other between languages by using the shared dialect of artillery. The capital convulsed. Pause. When the armies marched through and the court ran for its life along roads that had been designed to receive tribute, the dynasty learned how much humiliation could be packed into the space between two edicts. The one that said the boxers were wind sent by heaven, and the one that said the court had experienced a breeze it did not expect. Pusher the indemnities that followed were long numbers with punctuation, and they settled over the country like a fine dust that got into everything. School budgets, salt taxes, the price of a widow's last string of cash. Pause. New policies emerged not as an inspiration, but as a survival kit. Provincial assemblies to teach politics the shape of argument. A modernized army to teach violence the shape of drills that factories recognize. Examinations abolished in the name of utility, which meant 1,000 families found themselves in possession of teenagers who had memorized a world that no longer accepted their memory as currency. Sixi managed these conversions with a coolness that made friends call her wise and enemies call her stone. She could be generous in ways that felt, to recipients, like rescue. She could be ruthless in ways that felt, to observers, like logic pushed past the point where it should be permitted to walk. Pause. She knew the value of a stage, and therefore knew when to close the curtain. She knew the price of delay, and therefore habitually tried to pay it in small coins over many years. Pause. The emperor she had sidelined became a symbol almost against his will, a pale face in a narrow frame, rumored brave in the way young men are called brave when they have run out of moves. Pause. Their relationship was not a melodrama, it was a workplace tragedy, the kind that happens when an institution requires both speed and safety and assigns each to a different person. He believed that the time left to his house demanded leaps. She believed that leaping at the wrong angle would break both legs, and that in any case the floor was cluttered with obligations no leap could clear. Between those beliefs, the palace met foreign ministers, graded memoranda, signed railway charters, confiscated newspapers, and debated whether uniforms should be cut to resemble those of countries that might be enemies next Tuesday. Demonic, say those who suffered under the boxer's fists or under the punitive boots that followed, and the word fits if by it we mean the way fear teaches ordinary people to borrow the voice of gods. Demonic, say those who watch reforms put to death or domesticated into committees that met punctually and did not dare to innovate. And here too the word carries a certain weight. There was in that court a gift for making energy behave like an offense. Iwan, pause. But examine closely and you will see not a coven, but a bureaucracy at war with itself, a palace that had perfected the art of survival in an earlier climate and could not decide at the threshold of a new one whether to build a roof or learn to swim. Sukturk, pause. The punishments were real. Editors vanished into the polite afternoon of exile or the impolite midnight of arrest. Students discovered that hope, uttered too loudly, sounds like insolence to ears trained for deference. Generals found their supply lists entangled with etiquette, as if gunpowder should be stored in compliments. Pause. The generosities were real too. Schools opened that would not later close. Factories whirred that taught a generation the music of belts and steam. Railways pushed out and taught provinces that distance could be priced. When both figures died within days of each other, the capital felt for a moment like a stage where the scenery had been removed too quickly, exposing the ropes and pulleys by which the story had been kept moving. A child was lifted again onto a throne that had become a lecture hall, and the men who bowed knew that the lecture would be brief because the bell had already begun to ring from somewhere outside the walls. Shiriaoturn, pause. What remains of Guangxu and Xixi is not a neat verdict, but a pair of overlapping silhouettes. The earnestness of a youth who believed that renovation is a moral act that excuses its own speed, and the caution of a matriarch who believed that repair conducted under foreign eyes must be indistinguishable from dignity. Kirur, pause. If you walk today through the remains of the Summer Palace's corridors and catch, in the lake's reflection, a roofline that looks intact from certain angles and broken from others, you will have stood in the right place to remember them. Pause. The water will not tell you which was right. It will show you very patiently how a building that refuses to fall can still become a ruin, and how a ruin can host tourists who whisper the word demonic without deciding whether they mean the mobs, the ministers, or the mirror in which a very old country first saw its modern face. Betrayal. Pause. He was lifted onto the throne before he could hold a brush, and adults wrote his expressions for him. Delight at a procession he could not see over, solemnity before tablets whose names he had not learned, obedience to a choreography that was older than the furniture. Funny. Pause. The court, already expert at running on momentum, dressed routine as destiny and rolled it under the little boy's feet. From beyond the red walls came noises the ceremony could not absorb. Rifles speaking a new grammar, treaties that tasted of iron, foreign ministers with watch chains and schedules. But inside, eunuchs still knew when to light the lamps and when to murmur the syllables that make a day feel correctly balanced. Pause. When the abdication edict was penned in his name in 1912, its brushstrokes were measured to look as calm as the sky over the altar of state. The empire slid from beneath him like a carpet pulled expertly by servants who had long practiced the trick. Pause. He did not fall. He hovered, suspended by agreements that allowed the retired emperor to remain in the Forbidden City as if history were simply a long court recess. In the gardens, the peonies still open, the carp still threaded their way around lotus stems, and the boy learned the solace of rhythms that do not ask questions. Outside, the Republic, which possessed fewer rituals but an abundance of appetites, made new lists of what ought to be done and who ought to obey whom, and sent soldiers to persuade the hesitant. The years of palace twilight trained him in a peculiar skill, to live inside a museum as if it were a house. He studied calligraphy and foreign letters, played at sovereignty with a staff of men who could quote regulations with the same precision they applied to trimming a sleeve, and watched the world trespass more daringly each year across the line that once separated emperor from weather. Pause. The 1917 farce of Restoration, when an old-fashioned general attempted to wrap him again in the dragon robe for 11 days of anticlimax, taught him that crowns could be tried on like costumes in a theater with leaky roof, and that laughter travels faster than loyalty. Pause. In 1924, with the suddenness that resides in the hearts of men who have waited a very long time to be abrupt, troops loyal to a rival politician escorted him out through the Meridian Gate, with the courtesy shown to an heirloom being moved to a smaller apartment. Pause. He went first to a mansion in the foreign concession, where the walls were decorated in the style of people who prefer clocks to tablets, and where a boy who had been the axis of a civilization learned how to be a citizen by watching servants solicit tips from guests who called him Your Majesty because titles are sticky. By then, he had acquired a taste for being central, even when the circle was small. He had also acquired the sense, intoxicating and easily abused, that history still owed him a correction. Into those tastes stepped men who were trained to hear appetites as opportunities. In the early 1930s, the polite storm from the Northeast, dressed in railways and uniforms that honored the idea of punctuality more than the idea of consent, offered him a throne in a country shaped to fit a governor's map. Sapitun. Pause. He accepted because a map with one's name at the top is a powerful amulet against the memory of being led by the elbow out of one's own gate. And because the word emperor, when spoken in a new language, can sound like a rescue rather than a rehearsal. Pause. The state he presided over from behind ceremonial screens called itself a restoration, and described its mottled flags with the vocabulary of harmony. Its factories made assurances as efficiently as they made rails. Pause. Its officials learned to stamp documents with a speed that suggested mercy would be delivered by the next train. But the trains did not carry mercy. They carried soldiers and harvests earmarked elsewhere, and the countryside, instructed to love order, was asked to master a set of obedience drills in which the penalty for failure was a spreadsheet of punishments. In that capital, bright with electric signs, careful with salutes, he sat in rooms that had learned to be quiet about the origins of orders. Decrees arrived as if from his own hand and continued downward as if they were gravity. Edicts announced moral cleanliness and left out the chemistry of certain factories where the air took lives with a bureaucrat's thoroughness. Proclamations about harmony omitted the syllables that named what happened to those who did not hum the tune. Shaktifan, pause. He was not a monster even in his enemy's telling. He was a thin, earnest man who practiced looking like a portrait and who found, as many do when granted flattery with instructions attached, that signatures can be narcotics. Pause. What was demonic about his reign to those who lived under the regime that borrowed his face lay in the difference between pen and consequence. A neat decree advising agricultural reform would translate into coerced labor. Pause, a paragraph about hygiene would translate, at the edge of town, into a facility designed to test its premises on bodies that never met a judge. He floated, smiled, bowed, rehearsed the few phrases he was trusted to say aloud, while the blades landed elsewhere. And because he did not see them land, he told himself, perhaps, that the landing was rumor or necessity. Pause. People who came to audience rooms left with diagrams of how the world must soon be arranged. People who never came learned about arrangements from a boot on a threshold. He participated too in small pettinesses that become, in certain lights, large. Dismissals of men whose conscience could not be reduced to bullet points. Promotions of the warm and plausible who translated the empire's wants into the idiom he preferred. A domestic life bent around the barbed wire of other people's plans, in which women were enlisted into the campaign to make him feel like an Axis again. His impulse to be modern, shaped by tutors who pronounce foreign names meticulously and by furniture that encouraged the idea of a forward-facing life, was trapped inside a machine that used the future as marketing. Pause. On inspection tours, he waved from trains at villages that had been swept of everything but fear. In palaces, he studied maps where lines were so straight they looked like virtues. In mirrors, he tried on the expression of a man who has finally been given back what was taken and discovered that the expression does not hold when the lights are off. Pause. When war broadened its mouth to swallow the region whole, and when even elaborate politesse could not protect a client state from its patron's desperation, he began to experience the kind of solitude that comes to rulers who realize that their assurances are oxygen for someone else's fire. The collapse came with the speed of systems whose parts have long been unscrewed one by one. Flights plotted by men who had promised to die in place were canceled by the simple fact of a border that no longer recognized timetables. A plane that should have saved him carried him instead toward capture and a second life whose script smelled of interrogation rooms and years of listening to other people's definitions. Shupwer. Pause. In northern prisons with windows like narrow apologies, he learned, laboriously and then sincerely, to answer questions that had never been put to him when he was young. What is responsibility when you have been used? What is remorse when your hands are clean of blood but not of consent? Pause. What becomes of a man who has spent the best light of his life under lamps designed to flatter rather than to reveal? Later set free into a city learning to be new, he kept parks and wrote sentences that tried to exercise the theater with calm prose, and he married a woman who had learned to speak plainly. Pause. He became improbably a small citizen with a large past. and he walked among people who had found other names for power. The demonic part of his story, remembered by those who outlived the empire that used his profile for a stamp, is not that he enjoyed cruelty. It is that he taught without quite meaning to, and with the help of men who knew exactly what they were doing, how a crown can be used as a muffler. Pause. If you sit on a bench in a Beijing garden he once tended and listen to the water slide under a bridge, you will hear the moral clearest. Floating is not innocence when others are forced to drown for the sake of the picture. Per secretum pause, he inherited a throne that had already learned the secret of making wealth behave like music, and he conducted that orchestra with a confidence that made officials, merchants, and poets agree that they were living in the kind of century that later generations embroider with sighs. Pause. The early years of Xuanzang's reign were an argument in favor of balance. Taxes adjusted to encourage grain to move as naturally as a river, examinations tuned to draw competent minds out of counties where they had been hoarded as heirlooms, borders managed with a mix of punch and handshake, and a court that took itself seriously without losing its appetite for delight. Pause. He cultivated the arts not as garnish, but as governance. A culture that can describe its own pleasures with precision is a culture that believes it will last. The Pear Garden, his academy of performance, trained voices and gestures the way the ministries trained clerks, and its singers taught the capital to love the idea that beauty is a policy. Pause. He listened to music at night that sounded like well-run canals. He read in rooms where the air tasted of ink and plum. He walked in gardens designed to let a man feel, just for a moment, that effort and reward might be synonyms. The empire exhaled happily, and prosperity, fickle god, lingered because it liked the stories being told about it. He also found, as long rulers do, that the habit of success puts a film over the eyes. Eunuchs learned to be indispensable in the way only those who carry news between rooms can be indispensable. A minister whose smile was as polite as a conspiracy perfected the art of presenting talent as a threat and mediocrity as safe. Generals on the frontiers, the new Jiedushi, guardians fattened on necessary authority, began to resemble small civilizations with drums and accountants of their own. Pause. Xuanzang, who trusted poetry to reveal character and leisure to refine judgment, developed the kind of taste that in politics is easily mistaken for virtue. He preferred harmony, and harmony's enemies were those who said the word danger too loudly in morning court. Pause. Then love chose its hour. The woman we remember as Yang Guifei entered the palace long after the empire had decided that its own reflection was a pleasure. She brought with her a family that understood opportunity the way migratory birds understand thermals. Desire in a ruler need not be fatal when the house is in order, but desire is always centrifugal. It throws outward, and what it throws away first is attention. Pause. He renamed rooms for her and found that names, being spells, can enchant the namer along with the named. The court's geometry changed in a way that looks on parchment like a gentle curve, but feels in experience like a tilt. The emperor asked for more music. Ministers who needed to warn him learned to modulate their alarms to a key that would not jar the evening's mood. And Lu Shan, a frontier commander with the heavy charm of a man who has learned to make his size an argument, entered the story with jokes and obeisance and the borrowed dialect of loyalty. He danced comic dances to amuse the woman whose approval had become a second kind of currency. He ate with the unself-consciousness of men who intend to be generous with other people's granaries. He carried maps in his head where other people carried gratitude. Pause. A court that had been taught to enjoy its evenings kept setting the sun later, while on the edges of the realm, the Jiedushi built warehouses of consent. The machinery breaking had no single, dramatic sound. It sounded like rubber losing its spring, like the steady erosion of a bank no one notices because the river is calm today. When the rebellion came in 755, it came with the inevitability that attends events everyone has already predicted in private. The armies that were supposed to be the emperor's fingers closed on him like a fist. At court, he fled the capital on roads built to bear tribute and discovered, as many do when history accelerates, that the speed of events converts virtues into decorations. At Maui, the soldiers who had marched too long on too little stopped and demanded a sacrifice they thought would rewind the world. The death of Yang Guozhong, her cousin, and then, because grief is a greedy theologian, the death of Yang herself. Pause. In a ravine that still seems to exhale the breath of that hour, the emperor's love was taken from him by the soldier's demand, by the logic of men who had chosen survival over romance. He went on, because rulers often do. The empire went on, because empires sometimes can. The capital was retaken and lost and retaken. The rebellion frayed into factions that learned to hate each other as much as they hated the court. The emperor abdicated to a son and entered a long corridor of regret in which music sounded different. The demonic quality that later storytellers hear in his reign is not a scene of indulgence with obvious villainy. It is the soft insistence of comfort that persuades a country to believe that evenings can be eternal, that the gentle routine of a golden age is a guarantee rather than a gift. Pause. In the aftermath, governors did not forget the feel of autonomy, and the court could not forget the taste of dependence. The disciplined circulation that had carried grain and commands between center and periphery congealed into regions where orders had to negotiate with local weather. Tax systems revised for prosperity resisted being retuned for recovery. Roads built to bear entertainment troops learned to carry refugees. Poets still wrote, but now they counted the dead more carefully when they chose metaphors for autumn. The emperor, who had taught the capital that beauty is a policy learned in old age, that beauty can become a veil drawn over a map with holes. And yet even here, one should be honest about proportions. He was not a beast. He was a man who loved rightly in the wrong amounts and trusted a class of men, the polished, the agreeable, who managed comfort expertly without quite understanding risk. Pause. He funded temples and examinations with a broad hand. He studied with seriousness as well as appetite. He was not cruel. He was insufficiently afraid. The burden of the corpses that followed is too great to lay entirely at his feet. But the mathematics of rule does not let sovereigns off easily. Attention is a tax, and when it is evaded, the arrears are paid by people who never hear music at court. Pause. Stand on a hill where the rebels once camped and the loyalists once regrouped, and listen. What you will hear is wind combing dry grass, and beneath it, the faintest suggestion of drums. Sahayur. Pause. That is the hush of a golden hour, refusing to end until the dark taught it manners, and of a country that learned a lesson older than any poem, namely, that the prettiest rooms in a palace have doors that open onto roads, and that roads, if left untended because the evening is sweet, will carry enemies inward as politely as they carry tribute outward. Puck. Pause. He ruled as if beauty were a treaty that could be signed with the world, and for many years the world indulged him just enough to make that belief feel practical. Pause. Huizong's calligraphy slanted like a reed in a disciplined breeze. His paintings found the precise hinge between bone and blossom. His ear, trained in the new court pitches of refined taste, could tell whether a bell spoke clearly of bronze or had been compromised by the cowardice of tin. During that season, he remade the palace to be a gallery that happened to issue laws, a garden that happened to send grain orders, and he curated men in similar fashion, promoting those whose phrases completed his own with elegance and filing those whose tones were scratchy where he preferred silk. Pause. The capital, Bianjing, responded by learning to look gorgeous at the edges. Markets combed their stalls until fruit appeared to have been arranged by a painter. Tea houses reinvented steam as theater. The river under moonlight welcomed leisure craft that traced, with their lanterns, a cursive script across the water. In the ministries, meanwhile, a new seriousness about the outward shape of things encouraged memoranda to perfect their grooming. And even when the paragraphs discussed salt, armies, or tax quotas, they did so with the grammar of men who believe form to be a sort of content. Pause. Huizong was not a fool in any small sense. He was a genius for a particular kind of order, the order of the cultivated room. He commissioned a canon of the arts because he believed the state should keep a ledger of beauty just as it keeps a ledger of grain. It is a generous belief, and like many generous beliefs, it invites the world to test its generosity at the moment least convenient for audit. The tests arrive first as whispers along the frontier, and then as hooves that could be counted. The Yurshin, new rulers of an older hardness, read the song maps as a hunter reads tracks, and they found in the distances between prefectures the space required for a fast ambition. Pause. In the capital, the talk was of alliances and triangles, of inviting one frontier power to the table to help move another away from the door. In the north, the talk was of winter fodder, archery drills, and bridges too weak for what would soon cross them. Pause. Huizong preferred counsel that could be mistaken for reassurance, and the counselors who learned to flavor their sentences accordingly prospered. Others, trained in the arithmetic of walls and stipends, could not persuade him that stipends owed to soldiers are not a decoration upon loyalty, but its core. Armies neglected and then demanded upon, obeyed with the resentment of a man woken rudely, and asked for money he loaned last year. At home, factional taste became prison policy. Men associated with the wrong calligraphy of governance discovered that style can be prosecuted when style stands for a policy the emperor has tired of. Eunuchs with a genius for proximity translated moods into instruments. Pause ministers learned to count the season's favor by how often they were required to quote poems instead of numbers. The demonic tint that later ages would smell in Huizong's reign was not a lust for pain. It was the conversion of governance into curation, the calm with which a ruler, charmed by coherence, allowed the parts of the world that did not cohere to be handled by people who mistook neatness for remedy. When the horsemen came in force, the capital's perfection rippled like a garden pond struck by stones. Negotiations produced paper that folded beautifully and failed efficiently. Ransoms were counted by officials who still believed numbers could intimidate hunger. Relief commands went out stamped with seals that once made boatmen hurry and now inexplicably did not. Tournay pause. The emperor handed the throne to his son in a gesture at once responsible and too late, and tried to retreat into ritual as a man retreats into prayer when the house is already on fire. Pause. The Yurshin entered Bianjing with the curt competence of men who can smell organization and know which cords to cut. They loosened the city from its illusions, as a thief loosens a ring from a sleeping hand. The night called Jingkang Year 2 for the clerks who still added dates even as the calendar dissolved, was not one night, but the somber extension of daylight into a new kind of darkness. Palaces opened like dictionaries to foreign readers. Pause. The imperial family, powdered for propriety, was repackaged for travel. Treasures chosen to outlast dynasties obediently outlasted theirs and became other people's heirlooms. Huizong, the man whose ink had once taught bamboo how to be bamboo, became a parcel in a long procession north, and the taste he had taught a capital now tasted of iron and snow. Pause. His captivity, which the record treats with a lucidity that embarrasses sentiment, was the opposite of what his youth had promised. A life counted not by connoisseurship, but by the small mercies of routine. As a prisoner, the world over learns to become grateful for the predictability of bad food. It is easy, and therefore common, to blame a painting emperor for a military catastrophe, to see cranes and plum blossoms as culprits, and to forget that budgets and roads had been sliding for years before the first Yurshin arrow struck. Huizong did not invent the Song preference for negotiation or the civil suspicion of generals. He inherited a machine tuned to purr in good weather. What he did was to amplify its preference for purring, to teach his court to regard the aesthetics of management as management, and to trust too long and too deeply that correction could be deferred into the future as a line can be perfected on a second sheet of paper. Pause. The prisons into which he sent political opponents were not dungeons filled with screams so much as filing cabinets into which inconvenient men were inserted. The prosecutions had the steady voice of health inspectors. Pause. The punishments carried the tidy smell of disinfectant. That is what people mean when they say demonic about Huizong. Not that he delighted in pain, but that he allowed an abstract love of harmony to excuse the slow, procedural hurting of those who insisted the frame was crooked and the roof already leaking. Pause. Walk in imagination through the Kaifeng streets where the river glowed under lanterns. Set the lanterns one by one upon the water and watch them float toward a bend. Know that the bend is there, even if the light insists the canal continues straight. That is where the dynasty turned, and that is where a man who wanted to be remembered for line and color is remembered instead for the night that carried him away. Pause. He came to power in a palace that smelled of smoke and apology, and he cleaned both as if cleanliness itself had the virtue to reverse time. The eunuch whose shadow had blanketed decisions, Wei Zhongxian, was pushed into the category where tyrants go to instruct posterity, and the court exhaled in the relief that accompanies the removal of a single, too convenient villain. Pause. Chongzhen was young enough to be decisive and old enough to understand that decisiveness, on its own, is not a policy. He sat longer at his desk than men with more robust faith in delegation. He cut ornaments from budgets and phrases from decrees. He promoted men whose reputations for austerity preceded them like marching drums. Had he reigned in easier weather, he might have passed into the ledgers as a stern corrector of manners, an emperor whose name was used at dinner tables to frighten children into obedience. Shabir, pause. But the weather had turned, and what blows in from bad weather is not a single storm, but a sequence. Harvest failures that do not flinch at edicts, silver flows that behave like sulky gods when oceans away a market hiccups, border pressures that combine with internal tax fatigue to teach soldiers how to be bandits, and bandits how to be armies. Pause. The Ming revenue system depended on a coin that decided, in the late years, to trickle instead of pour. The transport system depended on arteries that were now clogged by neglect and theft. The military depended on stipends that increasingly arrived as IOUs in elegant script. The emperor could read, and he did, and the reading taught him that virtue can be a recipe for insomnia. He purged as if betrayal were a weed that could be uprooted once and for all if you could only grip it firmly enough. Ministers who argued too loudly became, in his suspicion, men who argued for themselves. Generals who lost became conspirators even when they had merely been hungry. The court learned that proximity to the emperor was a privilege that burned. Pause. His temper, contained then sudden, left a trail of severed careers that frighted the wise into a sort of superficial unanimity. It is not that he wanted cruelty, he wanted control, and in a house whose beams had long ago begun to rot behind the paint, control presents itself as punishment because other tools have already been sold. Pause. The provinces sent up reports that mixed panic with arithmetic. Bandit chiefs with improbable titles now numbered their followers in 10,000s. Garrisons needed shoes before they needed strategies. The gentry whose taxes had once buoyed the treasury learned to float upon exemptions negotiated in bad years and hardened into rights in worse. Meanwhile, the Manchus in the Northeast learned Chinese politics faster than the Chinese court learned the Manchus, and their banners, disciplined by necessity and appetite, brushed the borders like a horse's tail swatting flies it will one day trample. Spakuri, pause. The emperor fought on multiple floors of the same burning house, dispatching competent men to three corners, only to discover that competence, when starved of supplies and sabotaged by envy, is simply decency with a funeral schedule. Li Ziqing's rise was not a fairy tale of justice from below. It was the kind of arithmetic that happens when hungry men are given a slogan and a direction. Tax farmers with long memories and short mercy had taught counties to hate the state. Soldiers who had not been paid learned the very old lesson that a pike pointed inward can collect arrears. Monks, merchants, and deserters formed columns that could not parse policy but could read opportunity. As the swarm moved, it created its own oxygen. Towns opened gates because rumor arrives faster than couriers. Forts surrendered because the commander's cousin had been put to death for an error that looked, from the county yamen steps, indistinguishable from the error about to be committed. The emperor replied with decrees that still had the clean edges of his early reign, with appointments that would have redeemed the calendar if time respected intentions, and with punishments that convinced fewer and fewer survivors that fairness was the ultimate aim. He demanded that his generals be upright when the pantry was empty. He required loyalty from ministers who had learned, over 2 dynastic generations, that loyal men are chosen last when courtiers divide spoils. His severity, meant to hold the line where money could not, drove good men into rooms where they drafted resignation memorials more carefully than strategies. And the court, which had once scared itself into virtue, learned to be frightened into paralysis. Beijing's last week smelled of smoke and horse. The court's last arguments tasted of old phrases repurposed to clothe new despair. In the night of April 1644, the city's defenses were defenders in name. Its walls were metrics of pride more than obstacles, and Li Ziqing's columns entered with the pragmatic confidence of men who have discovered that historical gates are often locked with sentimental keys. Chongzhen did not flee. He paced through rooms that were already becoming artifacts. Sent for family, sent some away, failed to send others. He took lives a daughter with his own hand, an act that disgusts poets and yet repeats itself in palaces where capture is understood to be a sentence worse than death. Then climbed the hill behind the forbidden city to the place where emperors go for views and commoners go for air. The quiet rope he arranged for himself against a crooked tree is one of history's least ambiguous documents. The emperor left, in the roughness of his final notes, a portrait no calligrapher could improve. A man who had tried to be severe enough to arrest decline and discovered that severity, applied without the lubricants of money and luck, sounds to subordinates like accusation and to enemies like music. What followed has the compressed logic of dreams. The rebel who seized the capital could not hold it. The general who should have been the wall, Wu Sangui, used the language of righteousness to excuse the geometry of survival and open the past to the banners he hated yesterday. The dynasty that had exhausted itself with ceremony and corrections met the dynasty that had trained itself on cold and opportunity. People call those days demonic when they mean crowded. Crowded with arrests that were meant as examples and served as cinders. Crowded with commands barking down hallways already full of smoke. Crowded with decisions made at speeds that leave regrets no time to gather their thoughts. Chongzhen is easy to pity and easier to judge. He is the monarch who cleaned his house while the foundation cracked, who cut away ornaments and discovered that the ornaments had been mistaken for beams, who demanded from men a loyalty he could not reward and punished in them a fear he could not relieve. If you stand in Jingshan Park and look down at the red walls, you will see a geometry that insists upon order even now. If you turn and put your hand on the rough bark where the rope once bit, you will feel the opposite of geometry. Between those two textures lies the truth of his reign. A man of earnest edges inside a century that had lost its right angles, tightening knots because there were no nails left to drive. and dying not because he loved cruelty, but because he had convinced himself that cruelty was the last remaining proof of care. Hawikiyu, pause. If you place all these reins on the floor like a long scroll and walk its length with quiet feet, the ink resolves into a pattern that has less to do with fangs than with furniture. Pause. The demonic things Chinese emperors did were rarely the tantrums of monsters. They were the habits of caretakers who mistook the house for the people and the ledger for the heart. Begin at the start of the line, and the rhythm declares itself. Standardize, mobilize, canalize, memorize, pulverize, ritualize. The suffix changes, but the beat is steady, a drum you can fall asleep to if you're tired enough. Qin's iron broom scoured questions as if dust were treason. Han Wu's witch fever married the invisible to the instrument. Sui Yang's canal poured water and bones into the same trench. Wu Zetian weighed names until the scale itself learned to purr. Ming founders and finishers counted honesty until suspicion began to look like virtue. Zhengde played the throne as costume and billed the provinces for the ticket. Wanli withdrew so methodically that absence turned into a governing style. Yongzheng tightened screws until the machine stopped pretending it did not love screws. Qianlong edited the library with a hand so clean that missing books themselves became texts. Jiaqing and Daoguang tried to ban rot by edict and discovered that edicts are jars in which rot learns to pickle. Tongji's restoration raised scaffolds that became rooms. Guangxu's sprint and Xixi's break taught the palace the price of having 2 feet on different floors. Puyi floated while sharp, unblinking systems used his reflection for a seal. Xuanzong's golden hour forgot the sunsets. Huizong treated beauty like policy and policy like decor. Chongzhen cleaned as the house fell. Each case a variation on the same seduction, the same quiet sin. To confuse governance with arrangement and obedience with health. If there is a demon here, it wears spectacles, counts to the right total, stamps the paper with decision, and speaks in the tone people use when the discussion is over. Pause. It lives in forms. Forms for grain and conscription, for confession and reward, for bounties paid by head and pardons paid by signature. The demon prefers corridors to caverns, schedules to storms, rooms where the lamps burn very steadily and where the pencil is sharpened with a little knife that glints just enough to keep everyone neat. Walk the other direction along the scroll and you see the faces that paid for neatness. The peasants who learned to read policy by the angle of a tax collector's shoulders. The pressed men who marched because rice had been promised in the plural and delivered in the singular. The scholars who learned to remove adjectives from their sentences before sleep because adjectives are suspects when filing cabinets become prisons. The women in corridors who tied their hair in the same knot every day so as not to be noticed by a handwriting that could write them away. The eunuchs who became mirrors so polished that a master could not see the room behind him. The frontier families who learned to keep a bag packed because a drum can be polite right up until it isn't. The militia captain who built a pyramid of proof because bounty lives where mercy cannot afford rent. The clerk whose ledgers balanced and therefore slept, even as the village outside his window lilted under a new weight he could not quantify. The artisan in an arsenal who taught iron to obey and then grew frightened when obedience proved contagious. The child emperor who learned to color within lines drawn by strangers, and the old emperor who learned to say, without moving his lips, that harmony had been achieved. The empire's cruelty, when it came wearing boots and ropes, is simple to name. What haunts is the cruelty that arrived dressed as diligence. The pain diffused across procedures that, taken one by one, resembled chores. Pause. The censuses that kept bellies full in good years kept lists of bodies ripe for levies in bad. The roads that delivered relief delivered conscripts. The canals that carried rice carried rumor and resentment with the same efficiency. The great encyclopedias that saved memory taught the bureaucracy how to prune thought. Ritual, which kept the sky steady, taught power how to stand very still while lives rushed past like water. Over and over, emperors and their machines chose dissolves rather than cuts. No screaming, only the hush of a brush making the last stroke in a name and then pressing the seal. Pause. We call that demonic because we lack a better name for the sensation of watching a human thing be converted into a category. Yet to sleep through history, you must also tell the truth about the reasons people agreed to all this. The households that asked for order did not ask idly. They remembered wolves. Chaos has its own demonology. Bandits who tax with torches, famine that flattens grammar, commanders who collect daughters and grain in the same wagons, and imperial neatness, even when it bites, often bites softer than hunger. Pause. Standardizing axles keeps carts from breaking, even as it teaches minds to prefer parallel lines. Canals make rice cheap for the winter, even as they drown 1,000 names in the footnotes. Pause purges frightened thieves as well as saints. Inquests sometimes rescue the honest before they choke. A sharp rain delivers relief faster than a charming one. A book burned to warn skeptics might well be replaced by a granary built to feed children. And almost every cruelty we visited has a ledger column labeled, "Prevented worse." People slept, markets open, poets wrote, children were vaccinated by calendars long before needles were invented. And even those who hated the palace admitted in moments of tired honesty that a world of pure weather is a world of pure panic. Pause. The terror, then, lies not in the fact that emperors sometimes acted as if they were physicians. It lies in the scale at which their medicine became the diet, and in the way the dosage crept upward each time an appetite elsewhere in the system widened its mouth. Pause. A state is a set of habits. A dynasty is a memory of those habits, plus a few holidays. The reigns we have walked across are the chapters in which habit learned to protect itself by pretending to be virtue. When rivers run high, this is a kindness. When rivers run low, it is a blade. So what do we take with us now that the lanterns are out and the scroll has been rolled and tied? Perhaps only this. The demonic is not an apparition in lacquer. It is a choice repeated until it forgets it is a choice. It is the quiet belief that the straight line is good because it is straight. The stamp good because it is final. The schedule moral because it is tight. The harmony healthy because it is smooth. Pause. The antidote is not chaos. It is rough mercy. Officers who know when to put away the form and walk to the gate. Rulers who count hunger before they count heads. Scholars who keep a disobedient adjective or two in their sleeve. Craftsmen who leave a joint visible so the next repairer knows where to start. Pause. In every dynasty there were such people, and many wore the robe, and many did not. The ones who lasted are the ones you will not find in the index under famous. If you stand at dawn on a section of old road that still fits the modern tire, and listen for the empire breathing, you will not hear a demon or a saint. Pause. You will hear cartwheels, footsteps, wind through grain, a drum somewhere far off keeping a reasonable time. The question is always whether the drum is telling the harvest when to begin or the village when to kneel. In that question lives the difference between a caretaking that nourishes and a caretaking that tightens. Close your eyes and the centuries blur into a single room. A desk, a seal, an open window, a list of names. The hand that reaches for the seal pauses. The list rustles. Somewhere beyond the window a child cries and is fed. A levy is raised and is born. A poem is finished and then put away because morning has begun. That, finally, is the empire we have kept you awake to see. Not a theater of devils, not a gallery of saints, but a long experiment in whether power can make order without eating the seed corn of its own humanity. Pause. When people whisper demonic in the ruins and in the museums, they are not naming a monster under the bed. They are naming the feeling of lying there and realizing that the bed itself has learned to press back.